The laboratory sits in Paderborn, Westphalia. The year, 1805. A young man, barely 21, hunches over his workbench in the dim light of early morning. Friedrich Serturner has been working through the night again, extracting alkaloids from the milky sap of poppy pods. His hands move with practiced precision, adding reagents, heating solutions, watching crystals form in his glassware like frost on winter windows. What crystallizes before him that morning will change the world. He calls it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god who shapes dreams. The name seems fitting. The white powder in his flask promises something extraordinary. Pure relief from pain, measured in precise doses, 10 times more powerful than raw opium. Within weeks, Serturner tests it on himself and 3 young volunteers. The results seem miraculous. Within decades, morphine will flow through German pharmacies like a river. But here's what the records don't tell us. Did Serturner ever suspect what he'd unleashed? Did he lie awake at night, years later, wondering about the monster taking shape in laboratories across Germany? His published papers speak only of therapeutic triumph. His private journals, if they ever existed, have vanished into history's shadows. The pharmaceutical revolution that follows moves with terrifying speed. By mid-century, Germany's chemists have become the world's undisputed masters of molecular manipulation. They work in university laboratories and industrial facilities, competing to unlock nature's chemical secrets. In 1860, at the University of Göttingen, Albert Niemann isolates pure cocaine from coca leaves. The white crystalline substance makes exhaustion vanish, makes the timid confident, transforms depression into euphoria within minutes. Niemann dies 2 years later, at age 26. The official cause: complications from exposure to laboratory chemicals. He never lives to see what his discovery becomes. Pharmacies, across Germany, begin stocking cocaine in dizzying variety. Cocaine wine, cocaine lozenges, cocaine-infused tonics marketed as cure-alls for everything from melancholy to indigestion. The German chemical industry, Merck in Darmstadt, the rapidly expanding Bayer concern, Knoll, E. Merck, and dozens of smaller firms competes ferociously to synthesize and market these pharmaceutical miracles. Profit margins are extraordinary. International demand seems limitless. Then comes 1897. Felix Hoffmann works in Bayer's laboratories in Wuppertal. He's been tasked with finding a safer alternative to morphine, something effective for pain relief without morphine's known problems. On a late summer day, Hoffmann successfully acetylates morphine, creating diacetyl morphine. The compound seems perfect, more powerful than morphine, but supposedly non-addictive. Bayer's marketing department brands it heroin and launches an aggressive worldwide campaign. The advertisements show rosy-cheeked children, their troublesome coughs soothed by heroin syrup, healthy families thriving thanks to Bayer's innovation. The company ships heroin to pharmacies across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, establishing Germany as the undisputed pharmaceutical titan of the age. What Bayer's chemists don't mention, what perhaps they don't yet understand, is that heroin converts back to morphine in the human body. That acetylation actually makes the drug cross into the brain more efficiently, that they've created something far more addictive than the substance they meant to replace. The official story celebrates scientific progress. The truth, perhaps, tells a darker tale. In comfortable German parlors across the Reich, a new social ritual emerges. Doctors make house calls carrying polished leather cases. Inside, gleaming syringes, glass vials of morphine solution, pristine needles. Upper-class women host afternoon gatherings, where morphine injections accompany tea and conversation. The needle becomes a symbol of sophistication, of modernity, of participation in the scientific age. A doctor from Berlin describes the scene in his private diary, later discovered in his grandson's attic. They line up so eagerly, these refined ladies, rolling up their sleeves to receive the medicine. They speak of it like a gift from God himself. I try to warn them about dependency, but they laugh. Doctor, they say, you worry too much. This is medicine, not opium. This is science. The diary ends in 1914. The doctor's fate remains unknown. But beneath the triumph and celebration, the first cracks begin to show. By 1900, German physicians start documenting something troubling. They call it morphinismus, the morphine disease. Patients who began treatment for legitimate pain now cannot stop. They return to doctors with increasing frequency, demanding higher doses. They suffer terrible agonies when deprived of their medicine. They lie, they steal, they destroy their families pursuing the needle. Dr. Eduard Levinstein publishes a comprehensive study of morphine addiction in 1877, nearly 30 years before the new century. Levinstein describes patients who have become hollow shells, men who once held prestigious positions now living only for their next injection, women who've sold family heirlooms to pay for morphine. The symptoms he catalogues read like possession by malevolent spirits: the sweating, the shaking, the bone-deep agony of withdrawal, the psychotic desperation of denied doses. The medical journals fill with worried articles. Pharmacists notice certain customers returning with suspicious frequency. Some refuse to serve obvious addicts. Others, needing the business, or perhaps trapped in their own dependencies, continue supplying whoever pays. Yet, production continues. Bayer, Merck, and the other giants manufacture morphine, heroin, and cocaine in ever-increasing quantities. When questions arise about addiction potential, company spokesmen emphasize legitimate medical applications. When journalists investigate, advertising revenue gets withdrawn. When regulations are proposed, industry lobbyists descend on Berlin with arguments about medical freedom, about Germany's pharmaceutical leadership, about economic competitiveness. The pattern becomes clear to anyone willing to look closely. Profit trumps safety. Market expansion matters more than addiction prevention. Scientific prestige overshadows human cost. But here's what none of the official reports mention, what gets lost in the optimistic rhetoric of pharmaceutical progress: the sheer scale of normalization happening across German society. By 1900, cocaine and morphine have become so thoroughly integrated into daily life that their strangeness has evaporated. Doctors prescribe them for toothaches and sadness and exhaustion and sleeplessness and dozens of other conditions. Patients request them by name. Pharmacists stock them alongside more mundane remedies. The white powders have become as ordinary as aspirin, as unremarkable as cough syrup. A pharmacist in Munich keeps meticulous records unusual for the time. His ledgers, discovered during building renovations in 1978, reveal something striking. Between 1895 and 1914, his morphine sales increased 1,700%. His cocaine sales increased even more dramatically. And these are just the legal, documented transactions. The ledgers note nothing about the unofficial requests, the under-the-counter sales, the customers who pay extra for discretion. We know these patterns existed because the gaps in the records tell us, the careful absences. The pages clearly torn out, the columns of numbers that don't quite add up. What the pharmacist couldn't or wouldn't officially record might be more revealing than what he did. The 20th century arrives with Germany standing at the pinnacle of pharmaceutical achievement. German chemistry has given the world morphine, cocaine, heroin, and countless other compounds. The nation's chemists are celebrated as pioneers, as benefactors of suffering humanity, as proof of German scientific superiority. Universities across Europe send their brightest students to study in German laboratories. Pharmaceutical companies from other nations struggle to compete with German innovation and manufacturing efficiency. But there's another Germany taking shape beneath the official story. A shadow nation where hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, have developed dependencies on these pharmaceutical miracles. Where doctors write increasingly worried letters to medical journals. Where families hide their shameful secrets. Where the miracle cures have begun revealing themselves as something else entirely. The question already haunts the night, though few dare ask it aloud. What happens when an entire nation places its faith in white powders synthesized in laboratories? Consider what we don't know. The official statistics are fragmentary at best, deliberately vague at worst. How many Germans were addicted to morphine by 1900? The estimates range from 50,000 to 500,000, a tenfold difference that reveals how little anyone wanted to count. How many doctors had themselves become addicted? The medical profession maintains careful silence on this question. How many pharmacists? How many of the chemists who synthesized these substances? The documentation gaps aren't accidental. Medical records from this era show curious patterns of destruction and loss. Hospital archives from major German cities contain detailed information about surgical procedures, infectious disease outbreaks, and administrative matters. But addiction cases, when mentioned at all, receive only the briefest notations. Patient names are often redacted. Treatment outcomes rarely recorded. The systematic documentation you'd expect for a major medical crisis simply doesn't exist. Or rather, it existed once, and then it didn't. A Berlin researcher discovered something intriguing in 2008 while digitizing hospital records from the turn of the century. An entire floor of storage dedicated to private medical cases had been destroyed in a 1933 fire, a fire that somehow left surrounding floors untouched. The official report at the time mentioned the loss only in passing, but the hospital's inventory ledgers suggest that floor contained approximately 20,000 individual case files related to morphine and cocaine treatment. 20,000 files. Gone. 1 year after the Nazi Party took power. What would those files have revealed? What patterns of prescription and addiction? What evidence of medical complicity? What documentation of pharmaceutical company influence? We'll never know. The smoke rose over Berlin in 1933, carrying those secrets with it. Back in the early 19th century, as morphine begins spreading through Germany, Friedrich Serturner lives in relative obscurity. He never becomes wealthy from his discovery. Patent law at the time offers him little protection, and others capitalize on his innovation. Does he read the medical reports about morphine addiction? Does he visit patients whose lives have been destroyed by the substance he isolated in his youth? His final letters, written shortly before his death in 1841, contain one curious passage. I fear that what began as a servant to medicine has become its master. But perhaps every gift from Morpheus demands its price. Perhaps relief from pain requires payment in dreams. What did he mean? The interpretation seems obvious regret over morphine's addictive properties. But there's another reading, darker and stranger. Serturner had been experimenting with morphine for more than 30 years. He'd tested it on himself repeatedly. His late letters become increasingly erratic, filled with digressions and unusual imagery. His handwriting deteriorates. His thoughts circle back obsessively to certain themes. Was Serturner himself addicted to the substance he discovered? The question is never raised in official biographies. But the evidence lurks in the margins of his correspondence, in the testimony of colleagues who visited him late in life, in the careful silence maintained by his family after his death. The man who named morphine after the god of dreams may have spent his final years trapped in the nightmare his discovery enabled. By 1914, as Europe stands on the brink of catastrophe, Germany has built an entire pharmaceutical empire on these white powders. The industry employs tens of thousands. Exports generate enormous wealth. German chemical expertise has become a source of national pride. The Kaiser himself has toured major pharmaceutical facilities, posing for photographs beside gleaming production equipment. But questions haunt the margins of official histories. What responsibility do the chemists bear for the monsters they create with good intentions? What does it mean that the nation's greatest scientific triumphs might also be instruments of mass addiction? How does a society reconcile progress with the human cost of that progress? The answers, if they exist, remain hidden in archives that can't be opened, in documents that were destroyed, in family secrets that pass unspoken from generation to generation. Germany stands at the pinnacle of pharmaceutical achievement, unaware that its greatest scientific triumphs are about to become instruments of its own destruction. The morphine flows through pharmacies like a river, the cocaine dissolves on 1,000,000 tongues, the heroin soothes 1,000,000 coughs, and in laboratories across the nation, chemists continue their work, synthesizing new compounds, chasing new innovations, never quite asking whether humanity is ready for the power they're unlocking. A century later, researchers going through Bayer's archives discover something peculiar. The internal correspondence from 1897 through 1914, the years of heroin's introduction and rise, contains suspiciously few references to addiction concerns. The letters focus on production capacity, marketing strategies, competitive advantages. Reports from company physicians about heroin's addictive properties appear in the files, then disappear. Referenced in one document, absent from the next. Someone, at some point, curated these archives. Someone decided which truths could be preserved and which needed to vanish. We know this happened because of what remains. The gaps where pages were removed, the catalogue numbers that skip inexplicably, the letters that reference attached reports that are no longer attached. The archive becomes its own mystery, a carefully constructed narrative with all the uncomfortable elements edited out. What did those missing documents say? What data was deemed too damaging to preserve? What correspondence between executives and government officials, between researchers and marketers, between doctors and distributors, might have revealed the extent to which people in power knew they were creating an addiction crisis and proceeded anyway? These questions have no answers, only suspicions, only patterns of absence that suggest deliberate concealment. The 20th century dawns, and Germany marches confidently into an era of unprecedented pharmaceutical dependence. The white powders promise everything: relief from pain, escape from exhaustion, enhancement of human capability. They deliver on those promises, and then they demand payment, a payment that will come due in ways no one in those optimistic early years can imagine. In a small museum in Westphalia, you can see Friedrich Serturner's original laboratory equipment, the glassware he used to isolate morphine, the notebooks where he recorded his experiments. Visitors photograph these artifacts, these relics of scientific progress. The placards describe Serturner as a pioneer, a genius, a benefactor of suffering humanity. What they don't describe is the shadow his discovery cast. The millions who became addicted, the families destroyed, the lies told, the truths buried, the century of dependence that followed from one man's late-night work in a Westphalian laboratory. But perhaps that shadow was always there, waiting. Perhaps once humans discovered how to isolate and concentrate nature's most powerful compounds, the path was set. Perhaps the addiction crisis wasn't a failure of oversight or regulation, but an inevitable consequence of chemical knowledge meeting human vulnerability. Perhaps every gift from Morpheus demands its price. The question echoes through the decades that follow, through wars and economic collapse and political catastrophe. It echoes through families who hide their shameful secrets, through medical files that vanish in convenient fires, through pharmaceutical company archives carefully curated to present the most favorable narrative. It echoes still, in modern laboratories where new compounds are synthesized, in doctors' offices where prescriptions are written, in homes where pills are taken with the same confidence Germans felt in 1900. The belief that this time will be different, that this drug won't betray its promise, that science has learned its lesson. But late at night, when the pharmaceutical marketing fades and the optimistic rhetoric quiets, a different question surfaces, one that Serturner himself might have asked in his final, morphine-clouded days. What if the lesson can't be learned? What if the pattern is too deeply embedded in human nature, the desire for relief, the faith in chemistry, the conviction that we can control what we create? What if the white powders were never meant to be controlled? The story has only just begun. August 1914. The trains roll out from German stations, carrying young men toward the Belgian frontier. In their packs, rifles, ammunition, rations, letters from home, and in the medical wagons following behind, something else entirely: wooden crates stamped with pharmaceutical company logos, packed with glass vials of morphine. Millions of doses, enough to treat an army, or create one made of ghosts. The first battles produce casualties beyond anything the medical corps anticipated. At Mons, at the Marne, at Ypres, thousands of young men arrive at field hospitals with wounds that medieval torturers couldn't have imagined. Limbs torn away by artillery shells, faces obliterated by shrapnel, bodies broken in ways that make death seem merciful. The doctors reach for the only tool powerful enough to match this industrial-scale suffering. The syringes come out by the tens of thousands. Captain Ernst Junger will later write about the morphine injections in his memoirs, calling them little deaths that transport wounded men away from hell, if only temporarily. But here's what Junger doesn't write about, what his published accounts carefully avoid. How many of those men never came back from those little deaths? How many carried the needle's hunger home with them, long after their visible wounds healed? In the trenches of the Western Front, medical officers carry morphine in their packs like ammunition, standard issue. Essential equipment. When soldiers scream in the mud with legs blown away, when gas attacks leave men choking and blind, when the artillery barrages drive men mad with terror, morphine becomes the answer to everything. A letter from a German medical officer, discovered in a French military archive in 1994, describes a scene from the Battle of Verdun. We administered morphine to 300 men yesterday. By nightfall, 200 were dead, and the 100 who survived were already asking for more. Not for pain, their pain was extreme, yes, but for the escape. They'd discovered something in that injection, a door leading away from this place, and once you've found such a door, how do you convince a man not to walk through it again? The letter ends there. The officer's name is partially obscured by water damage. His fate remains unknown, but the official medical records from Verdun mention none of this. They catalogue wounds, surgical procedures, mortality rates. The word morphine appears only in supply requisition forms. The growing crisis of addiction among wounded soldiers, if documented at all, has been systematically removed from the archives that survive. By 1916, the war has settled into its long, grinding stalemate, the same trenches, the same wire, the same mud. But the men holding those trenches have changed. They've learned something the generals never intended to teach them, that certain chemicals make the impossible bearable, make fear vanish like smoke, make 3 hours of sleep feel like 8. Cocaine enters the war through unofficial channels. Soldiers discover that a dose before going over the top makes their legs work when terror should freeze them, makes exhaustion disappear, transforms ordinary men into something resembling the heroes from propaganda posters. The stimulant flows through the trenches in small tin containers, passed hand to hand, rarely mentioned in letters home. A diary found on a dead German soldier near Passchendaele contains this entry. Klaus gave me some of his white powder before the attack. I don't know what it was, but I felt like I could run through walls. We took the British position in minutes. Afterward, I wanted more. Klaus said he gets it from the submarine crews when they rotate back. Said they need it to stay alert underwater for weeks at a time. I believe it. I'd stay in this trench for months if I could feel like that again. The next entry, dated 3 days later, Klaus is dead. I searched his body before the stretcher bearers came. Found nothing. The war suddenly seems much longer than it did before. The submarine crews Klaus mentioned, they do use cocaine. German U-boat operations depend on it. Men locked in metal tubes beneath the sea for weeks, breathing recycled air, never seeing sunlight, listening to the hull creak under pressure. The psychological strain breaks men who lack chemical assistance, so the Navy provides assistance, unofficially. Through channels that leave no paper trail. We know this because of a single court-martial record from 1917, discovered in Kiel's naval archives. A U-boat captain faced charges of conduct unbecoming after a particularly erratic patrol. The testimony reveals that his entire crew was using cocaine supplied by the base medical officer with the knowledge of command. The captain was acquitted. The medical officer received a promotion. The court-martial records were sealed for 75 years. What other records were sealed? What other trials occurred? The archives suggest dozens of similar cases referenced in other documents, alluded to in correspondence, but the actual files have vanished. Back on the home front, a different pharmaceutical crisis unfolds. The British naval blockade strangles German food supplies. By winter 1916, the cities are starving. The official ration provides barely enough calories to sustain life. Children show signs of malnutrition. The elderly begin dying in their apartments, too weak from hunger to cry for help. And in this extremity, Germans discover something unexpected. Cocaine and morphine suppress hunger pangs, make the gnawing emptiness bearable, allow people to function on inadequate rations. In Berlin, women stand in bread lines for hours in the freezing cold. Then they return home and take morphine for their exhaustion and despair. Factory workers maintain impossible production schedules with chemical assistance. The pharmaceutical companies continue, operating throughout the war, their entire output now flowing to military and domestic survival rather than international trade. A social worker's report from Munich, dated December 1916, describes visiting working-class families. In one household after another, I found the same scene: empty cupboards, thin children, and hidden in drawers or behind books vials of morphine, packets of cocaine powder. The mothers told me the same story. Without the medicine, they couldn't manage, couldn't work the factory shifts, couldn't ignore the hunger, couldn't keep pretending everything would be all right. The medicine, they said, was more important than food. Food sustained the body, but the medicine sustained hope. The report was filed with Munich's Social Welfare Department. It generated no response, no policy changes, no investigation. The social worker filed 3 more reports over the following months, each more desperate than the last. Then the reports stop. Her employment records show she died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. She was 34 years old. But here's what the official histories don't mention. How many social workers, how many doctors, how many priests and teachers and civil servants filed similar reports? How many warnings went unheeded? The gaps in the archives suggest systematic documentation that no longer exists. References to the morphine crisis appear in ministerial correspondence, then disappear. Budget allocations for addiction treatment facilities show up in draft documents but vanish from final versions. Someone, at some point, made these records disappear. By 1917, Germany's military medical establishment can no longer ignore what's happening. Tens of thousands of soldiers have become morphine addicts. Men who received legitimate treatment now cannot function without daily doses. Some soldiers deliberately wound themselves superficial injuries that require medical attention and morphine injections. Others steal from medical supplies. The addiction spreads like an invisible epidemic through the ranks. But military discipline forbids open discussion. To admit widespread addiction would be to admit weakness, to undermine morale, to suggest German soldiers lack the strength to overcome their dependencies. So the medical officers write carefully worded reports that document the problem while avoiding explicit condemnation. They use euphemisms: pharmaceutical dependency, medical complications, treatment-related difficulties. A psychiatric assessment from 1917, recently declassified, describes the case of a young lieutenant. Patient exhibits extreme agitation when deprived of morphine injections, becomes violent, irrational. When supplied with morphine, demonstrates immediate improvement in cooperation and military bearing. Diagnosis: soldier's heart, complicated by wartime medication protocols. Recommendation: maintain current pharmaceutical support to ensure combat readiness. The assessment never uses the word addiction. But between the clinical language, the truth emerges. The army had created addicts and decided that managing their addiction was preferable to treating it. Easier to keep the morphine flowing than to address the catastrophic scale of the problem. How many similar assessments exist? The archives contain hints of thousands. But the actual documents, the detailed medical histories, the statistical surveys, the epidemiological studies that military doctors surely conducted have largely vanished. What remains are fragments, glimpses, shadows of a crisis too large to hide completely but too shameful to preserve in detail. November 1918, the armistice. Church bells ring across Germany. The war is over. The soldiers are coming home. But what's coming home with them? The trains arrive at German stations carrying hollow-eyed men in tattered uniforms. They embrace their families with trembling hands. They sleep in their childhood bedrooms and wake screaming. They attend welcome home celebrations and leave early, unable to endure the noise and crowds. They are home, but they are not home. Something essential has been left behind in the trenches, or perhaps something unwanted has been brought back. The addiction crisis that the military medical establishment carefully concealed now floods into civilian life. Veterans discover that the morphine that flowed freely at the front is suddenly unavailable. The pharmaceutical supplies that seemed endless during wartime have evaporated. Doctors, overwhelmed by the sudden demand and aware of the addiction problem, become reluctant to prescribe. Pharmacists turn away obvious addicts. The veterans face a choice: suffer through withdrawal or find other sources. A police report from Hamburg, dated March 1919, describes a disturbing pattern. Increasing incidents of pharmacy break-ins. The perpetrators, all former soldiers, steal only morphine and cocaine. They ignore cash, other medications, valuable equipment. When apprehended, they become violent and desperate. Several have stated they would rather die than endure another day without the medicine. The courts struggle to punish men who served the fatherland so recently. Sentences remain light. The break-ins continue. The pattern repeats across Germany. In Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne, former soldiers break into pharmacies, doctors' offices, hospital supply rooms. Some turn to the black market, where morphine and cocaine command extraordinary prices. Others simply suffer, locked in rooms by family members trying to help them through withdrawal. The medical profession faces a crisis of complicity. Many doctors feel guilty they prescribed morphine and cocaine so freely during the war, never considering the long-term consequences. Others blame the soldiers for moral weakness, insisting that disciplined men should overcome their dependencies. The medical journals publish articles debating treatment approaches, but the underlying question remains unasked. What responsibility does the medical establishment bear for creating hundreds of thousands of addicts? A letter written by a doctor in Leipzig to a colleague in Vienna, discovered in a private collection in 2003, addresses this question directly. We did this to them. We turned young men into morphine addicts in the name of treating their wounds. And now we abandon them, calling their addiction a moral failure rather than a medical consequence. History will judge us harshly for this, I think, if history bothers to remember at all. The letter was never sent. Perhaps the doctor lost his courage. Perhaps he realized that speaking this truth aloud would end his career. The letter remained in his desk drawer for decades, eventually ending up in an estate sale, purchased by a collector who didn't recognize its significance until researchers began asking new questions about wartime addiction. How many similar letters were written and never sent? How many doctors wrestled privately with guilt they couldn't publicly express? The pharmaceutical companies certainly said nothing. Bayer, Merck, and the others that had profited enormously from wartime morphine and cocaine production simply moved on to new markets, new products. Their internal correspondence from this period, what little remains accessible, contains no soul-searching, no acknowledgement of their role in the addiction crisis. Only discussions of post-war business strategies. The families suffer in ways that defy documentation. A mother watches her son, who survived Verdun, slowly destroy himself pursuing morphine. A wife discovers her husband has spent their life savings on black market cocaine. Children grow up in homes where pharmaceutical dependency shapes every hour of every day, but no one ever explains what's happening or why. These family tragedies leave no official record. No government statistics tracked the domestic impact of wartime addiction. No social welfare agencies systematically documented the problem. The silence that the military medical establishment maintained during the war extends into peacetime, becoming a national conspiracy of shame and denial. But occasionally, the truth surfaces in unexpected places. A memoir published in 1936 by a Berlin social worker describes visiting a veteran's apartment in 1920. He sat in a chair by the window, staring at nothing. His wife explained that he'd been home for 18 months, but hadn't worked since his return. He'd sold everything they owned, furniture, his medals, her wedding ring, to buy morphine. She showed me the injection marks on his arms, track after track after track. The war didn't kill him, she said. But the medicine they gave him during the war is killing him now. And no one will help us. The doctors say he's weak. The police say he's a criminal. The government says he's no longer their responsibility. He survived 4 years in hell, and this is how it ends. The memoir sold poorly, and has been out of print since 1939. Few historians reference it. The social worker's name, Marguerite Wolf, appears in no other historical documents. Her testimony stands alone, a single voice describing a crisis that touched hundreds of thousands of families but somehow failed to generate systematic documentation or public response. The war ends, but the chemical war within millions of German bodies continues. In attics and basements across the country, families hide their shame. Veterans struggle alone with addictions their service created. Doctors write cryptic notes in medical records, recording symptoms but never explicitly mentioning addiction. The pharmaceutical companies continue manufacturing morphine and cocaine for export now, since international trade has resumed. No one in power wants to discuss the monster that was created, or more accurately, that was deliberately manufactured and distributed to achieve military and economic objectives. And in the shadows, the black market awakens. Organized criminals recognize a sustainable business opportunity. Corrupt pharmacists become suppliers. Desperate veterans become dealers, selling to other addicts to support their own dependencies. The same substances that flowed through official medical channels during the war now flow through illegal networks, untaxed, unregulated, unacknowledged. A police investigation from 1921, discovered in Dresden archives, mapped an elaborate cocaine distribution network involving 17 pharmacies, 43 dealers, and an estimated 2,000 regular customers, 90% of them veterans. The investigation took 9 months. The final report ran to 300 pages. The district attorney declined to prosecute, stating that, given the number of war veterans involved, legal action would serve no useful purpose and might undermine public confidence in our soldiers' moral character. The 300-page report is missing from the archives. Only the district attorney's brief dismissal letter remains. What did that report contain? What patterns did it reveal about the scale of black market operations? What connections did it trace between pharmaceutical companies and illegal distribution? What testimony did it preserve from addicted veterans explaining how they'd been led down this path? These questions have no answers. The document is gone. Like so many other records from this period, it vanished at some point, deliberately destroyed, conveniently lost, archived in some location that remains sealed or restricted. The pattern of silence solidifies. The families hide their addicted members. The doctors avoid documenting the true scale of the problem. The pharmaceutical companies shift attention to new products. The government treats addiction as individual moral failure rather than systemic crisis. And the veterans, the men who survived the trenches only to become enslaved by the medicine that helped them survive, suffer in isolation, each one convinced he's alone in his struggle, unaware that his story repeats in apartment after apartment, city after city, across the entire broken nation. By 1923, the immediate post-war crisis has supposedly passed. The newspapers no longer report on pharmacy break-ins. The police have stopped investigating black market drug networks. The medical journals have moved on to other topics. Official Germany has decided, collectively and silently, to forget about the addiction epidemic that the Great War created. But the addicts remain. In attics and basements, in mental institutions and prisons, in respectable homes and desperate hovels, hundreds of thousands of Germans whose bodies remember the trenches through the chemical hunger that never fades. Their suffering continues, unacknowledged and undocumented, a ghost story that the nation refuses to tell. The question haunts the empty spaces in the archives. How many? How many German soldiers became morphine addicts during the Great War? How many died from their addictions in the years that followed? How many families were destroyed? How many children grew up watching their fathers slowly kill themselves with the needle? The estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The gap reveals how little anyone wanted to count, how thoroughly the silence was maintained, how completely the truth was buried beneath shame and denial and deliberate documentary destruction. The war ended in 1918, but for the addicts it created, the war never ended. It just moved from the trenches into their veins, from the battlefield into their homes, from public catastrophe into private suffering that would echo through generations. And above it all, the question that no one in power wanted to answer. If the medicine that saved lives also destroyed them, was it salvation or damnation? And who bears responsibility when the two become impossible to separate? 1923. A wheelbarrow full of German marks cannot buy a loaf of bread. The currency collapses so rapidly that workers demand payment twice daily, once at lunch, once at closing, so they can spend their wages before inflation devours their value. Life savings evaporate overnight. The middle class watches generations of accumulated wealth become worthless paper. But in the ruins of economic catastrophe, a shadow economy thrives, and its currency is measured in grams of white powder. The official exchange rate means nothing anymore. But cocaine has stable value, more stable than gold, more reliable than any government-backed currency. A gram of pharmaceutical-grade cocaine in Berlin is worth approximately the same in Munich, in Hamburg, in Frankfurt. The white powder becomes a medium of exchange, a store of value, a hedge against chaos. How do we know this? The evidence appears in unlikely places. A pawn shop ledger from Berlin, discovered during building demolition in 1997, records transactions from 1923. Between entries for pocket watches and wedding rings, curious notations appear. 5 grams, held for MK. Value equivalent to 4 weeks' rent. Another. Cocaine accepted as collateral. Customer reliable. Pharmaceutical grade confirmed. The pawnbroker kept 2 sets of books, one for official inspection, one recording actual transactions. The official ledger shows a struggling business barely surviving hyperinflation. The real ledger shows something else entirely. A thriving operation where cocaine functioned as an alternative currency, accepted, valued, and traded with the same casual efficiency as money once was. How many other pawnbrokers, how many other businesses, operated this way? The question has no answer, but the pattern suggests something. Far beyond isolated incidents, a systematic shadow economy where drugs replaced currency because currency had ceased to function. Berlin transforms into the drug capital of Europe. The nightclubs of the Kurfürstendamm pulse with artificial energy. In the El Dorado, the Silhouette, the White Mouse cocaine flows openly. Waiters deliver it alongside champagne. The wealthy snort lines between courses at expensive restaurants. The poor sniff cheaper, more dangerous mixtures in back-alley cafes. A Vice Squad report from November 1923 describes a raid on a Kurfürstendamm nightclub. Upon entry, we observed approximately 200 patrons. Cocaine use was ubiquitous and unconcealed. Packets of white powder lay on tables beside drinks and ashtrays. Several patrons offered us samples, apparently unaware we were police. When arrests were made, the detained individuals expressed genuine confusion. They believed cocaine use in such establishments was legal, or at least officially tolerated. One woman, a schoolteacher, stated, "Everyone does this. The doctor prescribed it for my nerves. What law am I breaking?" We could not provide a satisfactory answer. The report concluded with a troubling admission. Enforcement appears futile. The scale of use exceeds our capacity to address. Resources are inadequate. Public opinion does not support aggressive action. Recommendation: focus efforts on violent crime and property theft. Berlin's police, in other words, surrendered. They chose not to fight a war they couldn't win. The nightclubs continued operating, the cocaine continued flowing, and official Berlin pretended not to notice. But here's what that police report doesn't mention. Who supplied the nightclubs? Where did pharmaceutical-grade cocaine come from in quantities sufficient to supply hundreds of establishments serving thousands of customers nightly? The supply chain must have been sophisticated, reliable, and remarkably efficient. The answer lies in documents that surfaced during a corporate merger in 2004. Bayer's internal correspondence from 1923 reveals that the company's domestic cocaine sales, supposedly restricted to medical use, increased 300% during the hyperinflation period. The letters discuss alternative distribution channels and non-traditional markets without ever explicitly mentioning nightclubs or recreational use. But the numbers tell the story the words avoid. 300% increase. During a year when Germany's economy collapsed, when legitimate pharmaceutical demand should have plummeted. Where did all that cocaine go? The pharmaceutical companies found profitable business in chaos. When traditional currency became worthless, they accepted payment in foreign currency, in gold, in valuable goods. The cocaine flowed to those who could pay, regardless of intended use. The companies maintained plausible deniability officially. They sold to licensed pharmacies and medical suppliers. What happened afterward wasn't their responsibility. Or so they claimed in the few documents that discuss this period at all. Most of the relevant correspondence has vanished. References to Berlin operations and special markets appear in company ledgers, but the detailed records, shipping manifests, customer lists, payment receipts are missing from archives that otherwise maintain meticulous documentation. The jazz clubs provide the soundtrack to this chemical apocalypse. Musicians perform marathon sets, fueled by cocaine, playing until dawn. The music has a frantic quality, a desperate edge. Dancers move with supernatural energy, their movements precise and machine-like, sustained by white powder rather than human stamina. An American journalist visiting Berlin in 1924 writes, "The city has a fever, the nightclubs never close, the music never stops, everyone seems to be moving at double speed, talking faster, thinking faster, living faster." I asked my guide what fueled this manic energy. He laughed and showed me a small tin container. "Everyone uses this," he said. "The waiters, the musicians, the dancers, the customers. It's as common as coffee. More common. Actually, coffee is expensive, but cocaine is everywhere." The journalist's article was rejected by his American newspaper as exaggerated and implausible. The manuscript sat in his personal papers until his death in 1968. His family donated his archives to a university library, where the article remained unnoticed until a graduate student discovered it in 2009. By then, other evidence had emerged confirming everything the journalist described. But for decades, his testimony was dismissed as sensationalistic fabrication. How many other accounts were dismissed? How many journalists, how many visitors, how many Germans themselves tried to document what was happening, only to be ignored or disbelieved? The cabaret performer Anita Berber becomes the symbol of this era. She performs naked except for gold body paint, her routines mixing eroticism and grotesquerie. She's addicted to cocaine and morphine. She's dying tuberculosis and substance abuse destroying her body simultaneously. She's 29 years old and looks 20 years older. She performs in Berlin's most prestigious theatres and makes a fortune. She spends it all on drugs. Berber dies in 1928 in a sanatorium at age 29. Her death certificate lists tuberculosis as the cause. It makes no mention of cocaine or morphine, though witnesses report she was using both substances until her final days. The certificate is technically accurate. Tuberculosis did kill her, but it tells only part of the truth. How many death certificates from this era tell similar partial truths? How many Germans died from drug-related causes that were officially attributed to other conditions? The statistical record provides no answers because the question was never systematically asked. The artists and intellectuals embrace cocaine with particular enthusiasm. Writers discover it makes words flow faster, makes the blank page less terrifying, makes deadlines manageable. George Gross paints cocaine users with brutal honesty, hollow-eyed figures in expensive clothes, the walking dead disguised as the living. His paintings disturb viewers precisely because they capture something true that polite society prefers not to acknowledge. Klaus Mann, Thomas Mann's son, writes in his diary about Berlin's drug culture. The entries are frank and troubling. Everyone uses cocaine. The actors, the writers, the directors. It's not considered unusual or shameful. It's simply what one does to maintain the pace, to keep up with the demands of artistic life in Berlin. I've tried it myself. The effect is remarkable. Fatigue vanishes. Self-doubt disappears. Everything seems possible. But I've noticed something disturbing. The people who use it most heavily are changing. Their eyes develop a certain hardness. Their movements become jerky and unpredictable. They speak too fast, shift topics too abruptly. Something essential is being lost, though I cannot articulate exactly what. Mann's diaries were published decades after his death. In 1990, certain entries from the Weimar period were excluded from earlier editions deemed too sensitive, too revealing of behaviors that might tarnish Mann's literary reputation. Only in the complete, unedited edition do we see his frank accounts of Berlin's drug culture. How many other diaries, how many other private accounts, remain unpublished or heavily edited? But beneath the glamorous surface of nightclub culture, ordinary Germans suffer in silence. The middle-class housewife who started taking morphine for her headaches during the war now cannot face her day without it. The factory worker who discovered cocaine helps him work double shifts to afford food for his children. The veteran who still wakes screaming from nightmares every night and finds that only morphine lets him sleep. A social welfare report from Stuttgart, dated June 1924, describes visiting working-class families. In 6 households visited this week, I found evidence of significant morphine or cocaine use in 5. The pattern is disturbingly consistent. One or both parents using substances to cope with economic hardship, exhaustion, or psychological distress. The children are often aware but helpless. In one home, a 10-year-old girl showed me where her mother hides the morphine vials. She takes the medicine to stop crying, the girl explained. Otherwise, she cries all day. The report generated no institutional response, no increased funding for social services, no public awareness campaign. The social worker filed similar reports for the next 8 months, then stopped. Her employment records show she resigned for personal reasons in February 1925. What personal reasons? The archive offers no explanation. The pharmacists occupy an uncomfortable position in this crisis. They're trained professionals, bound by ethical guidelines and legal restrictions. But they're also business owners struggling through hyperinflation. When customers arrive requesting morphine or cocaine with cash, with gold, with something of value, the temptation to dispense becomes overwhelming. A pharmacist in Hamburg keeps a coded journal discovered by his grandson in 2011. The entries from 1923 reveal his moral struggle, another day of impossible decisions. A woman came in, clearly an addict, requesting morphine. I refused. She offered me a gold bracelet, real gold, worth more than a month of legitimate business. I still refused. She began crying, begging, saying she'd rather die than face another day without the medicine. What am I supposed to do? If I give her morphine, I enable her addiction. If I refuse, I send her to the black market, where she'll get impure drugs or be exploited by criminals. There are no good choices. The journal continues for months, the pharmacist's entries growing increasingly desperate. Then, abruptly, the ethical anguish disappears from his writing. The later entries are matter-of-fact, businesslike. Dispensed morphine to MS. Payment in silver coins. Dispensed cocaine to HW. Payment in American dollars. No more moral questioning, just transactions. What happened? Did the pharmacist surrender to economic necessity? Did he rationalize his decisions as harm reduction better to provide pharmaceutical-grade drugs than force customers to the black market? Or did he simply exhaust his capacity for ethical resistance? The journal never explains, and the pharmacist never discussed these years with his family. His grandson discovered the journal after the man's death, hidden in a locked drawer. The family donated it to a medical history archive, where it sits alongside thousands of other documents describing Weimar Germany's pharmaceutical crisis, a crisis that somehow generated enormous documentation but little sustained historical attention. The medical profession faces its own crisis of complicity. Dr. Hans Harmsen in Hamburg begins documenting the scale of addiction, estimating hundreds of thousands of Germans dependent on morphine, cocaine, or both. He describes patients who've sold everything they own to feed their addiction, families destroyed by chemical dependency, children growing up in homes where parents spend more on drugs than food. Harmsen publishes his findings in medical journals. The articles generate controversy and denial. Other physicians dispute his numbers, arguing he's exaggerating or including occasional users in his calculations. Pharmaceutical industry representatives suggest Harmsen has an anti-business agenda. Some doctors accuse him of sensationalism, but here's what's strange. Harmsen's detailed case files, the individual patient records that supported his published statistics, have disappeared. The Hamburg medical archives contain his published articles, but none of his underlying documentation. Hospital records from the clinics where Harmsen worked show gaps corresponding to the years 1922 through 1927. The gaps are never explained. Did Harmsen's documentation threaten too many powerful interests? Was the evidence systematically destroyed to discredit his findings? Or did the records simply vanish through ordinary archival neglect? The question matters because without Harmsen's detailed case files, his statistics can be dismissed as unsupported speculation. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Later researchers questioning the scale of Weimar-era addiction often cite the lack of detailed documentation. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, yet Harmsen's published articles contain details too specific to be fabricated. Patient ages, occupations, socioeconomic backgrounds, progression of symptoms, treatment outcomes. Either he invented all of this, which seems unlikely for a respected physician, or the supporting documentation existed and was later destroyed. The pharmaceutical companies navigate this chaos with carefully crafted silence. Bayer, Merck, and the others continue manufacturing cocaine and morphine in enormous quantities. Officially, production is for export. Germany's pharmaceutical industry rebounds quickly after the war, and international markets remain lucrative. But domestic consumption during the hyperinflation years suggests substantial quantities never leave Germany. Company records from this period are remarkably incomplete. Shipping manifests exist, but destination details are often vague: medical suppliers, Berlin region, rather than specific pharmacies or hospitals. Financial records show cocaine and morphine sales, but rarely identify customers. When the journalists investigate, the companies cite patient privacy and commercial confidentiality. A rare glimpse behind this wall of corporate discretion came during a stockholder dispute in 1926. Court documents include internal Merck correspondence discussing domestic special markets during the hyperinflation period. One executive writes, "Our Berlin operations proved highly profitable during the crisis years. Demand exceeded all projections. Distribution channels operated efficiently despite economic chaos. Recommend maintaining established relationships for future contingencies." What were these established relationships? The correspondence never specifies, but the profit margins cited in the documents, 40 to 60% on domestic cocaine sales during 1923, suggest something beyond normal pharmaceutical commerce. The court case was settled out of court. The documents were sealed as part of the settlement. They surfaced only when a researcher obtained permission to review sealed cases for a broader study of Weimar-era business practices. The researcher published a footnote mentioning Merck's profitable special markets, but never investigated further. The opportunity to examine Merck's wartime and hyperinflation-era operations passed. By 1928, as Germany achieves some economic stability, the cocaine and morphine epidemic should become a national priority. The currency has been reformed, employment is rising, the crisis years seem to be ending. This would be the moment to address addiction systematically, to fund treatment programs, regulate pharmaceutical distribution more strictly, investigate the networks that profited from the chaos. Instead, the opposite happens. The problem becomes a national secret. Families hide their addicted members behind perfectly maintained facades. The prosperous suburbs of Hamburg and Munich and Berlin present images of normalcy, well-kept houses. Children in school, fathers employed, mothers managing households. Behind closed doors, the reality is often quite different. A memoir published in 1968 by a woman who grew up in Berlin during the Weimar years describes her family's secrets. My father used cocaine daily. He kept it in his study, in a locked drawer. Everyone in our family knew, but we never discussed it. When visitors came, father was charming and witty. The cocaine made him sociable. After they left, he became irritable and paranoid. My mother took morphine for her nerves. She thought we children didn't know. But we knew. We always knew. The whole neighborhood probably knew. But no one ever spoke of it. That was the unwritten rule. Don't acknowledge what's happening in your own home, and we won't acknowledge what's happening in ours. How many families lived this way? How many children grew up knowing their parents' secrets while maintaining the public fiction of normalcy? The question has no statistical answer because the behavior, by definition, was hidden and undocumented. Employers quietly dismiss workers whose drug use becomes impossible to ignore. No confrontations, no explanations, just sudden unemployment. The workers know why they've been fired, but the official record never mentions addiction. The pattern protects reputations, both the employers and the employees, while ensuring the problem remains invisible in employment statistics. Society develops an unspoken agreement to pretend the problem doesn't exist on the scale it actually does. The newspapers rarely mention addiction. The government doesn't collect systematic data. The medical establishment publishes articles in specialized journals but doesn't push for public awareness. The pharmaceutical companies certainly don't advertise their role in the crisis. The silence serves everyone's interests except the addicts themselves. A police detective in Frankfurt writes to a colleague in Vienna in 1929. We all know what's happening. Everyone in law enforcement, everyone in medicine, everyone in local government, we all see the same patterns. The break-ins, the overdoses, the families destroyed. But we've collectively decided not to talk about it, not to count it, not to make it official. Because once it becomes official, we'd have to do something about it. And doing something about it would require resources we don't have, and would reveal the extent to which respectable society is implicated. So we maintain the silence. We process individual cases without acknowledging the pattern. And the problem continues, invisible in plain sight. The letter was intercepted by Austrian authorities during a routine screening of international mail, a common practice at the time. It was filed in intelligence archives as potentially relevant to cross-border crime. There it sat for 80 years, unread, until a researcher studying Weimar-era law enforcement stumbled across it. The detective's name meant nothing to historians. His career was unremarkable, but his letter articulated something that official documents never acknowledged. The conspiracy of silence was deliberate, systematic, and maintained by tacit agreement across multiple institutions. The shame of addiction combines with the shame of defeat and economic collapse to create a culture of silence that will have devastating consequences in the decade to come. Germans want to believe they're rebuilding, recovering, moving forward. Acknowledging the addiction crisis would mean admitting that the war's damage extends far beyond destroyed buildings and lost territory. It would mean confronting the ways that Germany's pharmaceutical genius had become its curse. So, the silence deepens. The addicts suffer alone. The families hide their secrets. The doctors write careful notes that obscure rather than reveal. The pharmaceutical companies count their profits. The government prioritizes other concerns. And Weimar Germany presents to the world, and to itself, an image of stability and recovery that masks profound dysfunction underneath. In 1933, everything will change. A new government will promise to purge Germany of Weimar's decadence. The cocaine and morphine epidemic will be attacked as evidence of national decay, as Jewish corruption, as weakness that the new Germany won't tolerate. But here's the darkest irony. The regime that condemns Weimar's drug culture will create an even worse pharmaceutical crisis. The white powder that flows through Berlin's nightclubs in the 1920s will seem innocent compared to what's coming. The addiction that destroys thousands of individual lives will be replaced by a drug that enslaves millions. The official story will say the Nazis cleaned up Weimar's mess. The truth buried in archives that remain partially sealed, scattered across documents that no one has assembled into a comprehensive account, tells a different story entirely. A story of continuity rather than change, of problems that weren't solved but transformed, of the same pharmaceutical companies serving new masters, of addiction that didn't end but evolved into something even more dangerous. But in 1928, as the Weimar era approaches its end, none of this is yet visible. The nightclubs still pulse with music and cocaine. The families still hide their secrets. The silence still holds. And Germans still have to believe that the worst is behind them. 1933. A new government promises to purge Germany of Weimar's decadence. The propaganda machine attacks cocaine and morphine as symbols of national decay, as evidence of Jewish corruption, as weakness that the new Germany will eliminate. Adolf Hitler himself delivers speeches condemning drug abuse as un-German. The message is clear and absolute. The Third Reich will be built on strength, discipline, and racial purity, not chemical crutches. The Nazi Party's anti-drug rhetoric seems sincere at first. Police raids on Berlin nightclubs increase. Known dealers are arrested. Addicts are sent to work camps where forced labor supposedly cures dependency. The government publishes pamphlets showing the contrast between degenerate drug users and healthy Aryan youth. The campaign creates an impression of moral crusade, but something strange appears in the pharmaceutical industry records. Despite the anti-drug rhetoric, cocaine and morphine production doesn't decrease. It stabilizes at approximately Weimar-era levels. The drugs are still being manufactured, still being distributed. The official explanation: medical necessity, export markets, scientific research. The real story, as always, hides in the gaps. A chemist named Fritz Hauschild works for Temmler Pharmaceuticals in Berlin. In 1937, he successfully synthesizes methamphetamine, not the first to do so, but the first to create a version suitable for mass production. Temmler brands it Pervitin and begins manufacturing small white tablets, each stamped with the company logo. The drug arrives at a perfect moment. Hitler's government needs workers who can meet impossible quotas, soldiers who can march beyond human limits, citizens who embody the superhuman ideal of Nazi ideology. Cocaine is tainted by Weimar associations. Morphine makes users passive. But methamphetamine creates exactly what the regime desires: alert, energetic, confident, tireless, obedient. Here's what the official histories rarely mention. The transition from condemning drugs to distributing them happens almost overnight, and it happens with remarkable coordination between government and industry. Internal Temmler documents from 1937, obtained by researchers in the 1990s after lengthy legal battles, show that Wehrmacht medical officers were consulting with the company before Pervitin reached the market. The military was involved from the beginning, helping design dosage, suggesting applications, planning distribution systems. By 1938, Pervitin floods through German society with explicit government approval. The pharmaceutical companies manufacture millions of tablets monthly. Drugstores sell Pervitin over the counter, no prescription required. Think about that. A regime that supposedly abhors drug use allows stimulant tablets to be sold as freely as aspirin. The advertisements are telling. They don't mention euphoria or pleasure. They emphasize productivity, endurance, duty. Pervitin keeps you alert during long work shifts. Pervitin helps you serve the Reich more effectively. The drug is marketed as patriotic, as a tool for building the new Germany. Students take Pervitin to study through the night. Factory workers take Pervitin to exceed production quotas. Housewives take Pervitin to maintain spotless homes while managing multiple children. Long-distance truck drivers take Pervitin to drive through the night without rest. The normalization happens faster than it did with morphine and cocaine, perhaps because Germany has already learned how to incorporate powerful drugs into daily life. A diary entry from a Berlin University student, dated November 1938. Everyone in my study group uses Pervitin during exam periods. The professor mentioned it in class, jokingly suggested we take our vitamins before the final. The pharmacy near campus stocks it prominently, right by the entrance. The pharmacist recommended I take 2 tablets before studying, 1 more if I need to stay awake past midnight. This is completely normal now, as normal as drinking coffee. The diary was donated to a university archive in the 1970s. The student who survived the war and became a teacher never mentioned his Pervitin use to his own children. They discovered the diary after his death and were shocked by the casual descriptions of methamphetamine use. To them, raised on drug war rhetoric, their father's testimony seemed almost unbelievable, but the evidence is clear. For a period in late 1930s Germany, methamphetamine was as culturally acceptable as caffeine. The military's involvement intensifies rapidly. Beginning in 1938, Wehrmacht units receive Pervitin during training exercises. Soldiers are ordered to take the tablets before long marches. The results impress the military leadership. Men can march longer, sleep less, maintain focus under stress. No one asks about long-term effects. The immediate tactical advantages seem too valuable. A Wehrmacht medical officer's report from March 1939, declassified in 2002, describes Pervitin trials with a tank unit. The crews maintained operational readiness for 72 continuous hours. Alertness remained high. Mood was elevated. Physical performance exceeded normal expectations. Minor side effects noted: elevated heart rate, reduced appetite, difficulty sleeping after cessation. Overall assessment: highly effective for sustained operations. Recommend broader distribution. The report makes no mention of addiction potential, no discussion of psychological effects, no consideration of what happens when men who've been awake for 72 hours on methamphetamine suddenly face combat. The focus is purely tactical, purely short-term, and based on reports like this, the Wehrmacht commits to Pervitin as standard issue. September 1939. The invasion of Poland becomes history's first methamphetamine-fueled military campaign. German tank commanders receive Pervitin to stay alert during rapid advances. Infantry soldiers receive Pervitin before night marches. Luftwaffe pilots take Pervitin before missions. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, runs on more than just tactical innovation. It runs on white tablets stamped with Temmler's logo. But here's what the military records from Poland don't emphasize: the strange behavior that begins appearing in after-action reports. Soldiers making reckless decisions, officers issuing erratic commands, units advancing beyond sustainable positions because the men don't feel fatigue that should stop them. A company commander's diary from the Poland campaign, discovered in a Russian archive in 1996. The men are acting strangely. They don't sleep even when ordered to rest. They talk incessantly, jumping from topic to topic. Several have become paranoid, certain that Polish forces are everywhere. Yesterday, a soldier fired at shadows for 20 minutes. When I confronted him, he insisted he'd seen enemy movement. But there was nothing there. His eyes, I've never seen eyes like that. Too wide, too bright, like he was looking at something beyond this world. The diary ends abruptly. The commander was killed 2 days after that entry. Whether the strange behavior he described had any connection to his death, we'll never know. But the pattern he documented, paranoia, hallucinations, erratic behavior, appears in multiple accounts from the Poland campaign. Always briefly mentioned, never systematically investigated. May 1940. The invasion of France reveals Pervitin's terrible potential on a larger scale. The Wehrmacht distributes 35 million Pervitin tablets during the 6-week campaign. 35 million. Think about that number. The entire invasion force was roughly 3 million men. That's more than 11 tablets per soldier, and distribution wasn't even universal. Some units received substantially more. Tank crews, in particular, consumed Pervitin at astonishing rates. They drove for days without sleep, advancing faster than Allied commanders considered possible. The legendary speed of the Blitzkrieg, the seemingly superhuman endurance of German forces, it had a chemical foundation that the Allies didn't discover until after the war. A captured German soldier, interrogated by French intelligence in June 1940, described his unit's Pervitin use. We received the tablets every morning, mandatory, like roll call. The officers called them alertness aids. After taking them, you felt invincible, like you could fight for days without rest. And we did. We drove from the border to the coast, barely stopping. Some men didn't sleep for a week. When the tablets wore off, you felt terrible, exhausted, depressed, sick, but then they'd give you more tablets, and you'd feel invincible again. The interrogation report was filed in French military archives. It sat there for decades, one testimony among thousands, unremarkable, except for the detail about mandatory drug distribution. French intelligence, overwhelmed by France's collapse, never investigated this aspect of German military capability. The report surfaced only when a researcher studying Wehrmacht logistics noticed the reference to alertness aids and wondered what that meant. Behind the military victories, problems multiply in ways the Wehrmacht cannot ignore indefinitely. Soldiers on Pervitin experience terrifying side effects. Medical officers begin sending reports to headquarters describing hallucinations, paranoia, heart palpitations, complete mental breakdowns. Some men become violent and unpredictable. Others suffer heart attacks despite being young and physically fit. A psychiatric assessment from a military hospital in Munich, dated August 1940, describes a 19-year-old soldier. Patient presents with severe paranoid delusions following extended Pervitin use during France campaign. Believes his commanders are trying to poison him. Attacked a medical orderly, convinced the man was a spy. Physical examination reveals severe weight loss, elevated heart rate, signs of malnutrition despite adequate food availability. Patient reports taking Pervitin continuously for 18 days during combat operations. Diagnosis: stimulant psychosis. Prognosis: uncertain. Recommend extended hospitalization and absolute prohibition of further Pervitin use. The assessment includes a troubling postscript. This is the 7th similar case admitted this month. Request guidance on reporting procedures and whether broader pattern should be communicated to command. No response to this request appears in the file, and the broader pattern was never officially communicated to command, or if it was, those communications have vanished from the archives. What remains are individual case files scattered across multiple hospitals, each treated as an isolated incident rather than evidence of systematic problems. How many soldiers suffered stimulant psychosis? The question has no definitive answer. The case files that survive suggest hundreds, possibly thousands. But the files that survive are almost certainly incomplete. Many military medical records were destroyed during the war's final chaos, and others were selectively preserved or destroyed in the post-war period. Meanwhile, at the highest levels of power, a different chemical dependency develops. In 1941, Dr. Theodor Morell becomes Hitler's personal physician. Morell's treatment regimen eventually includes daily injections of a compound he calls vitamultin, which contains oxycodone and cocaine, among other substances. Hitler receives these injections before important meetings and speeches. Morell keeps detailed records of his treatments. His logs survive, captured by American forces and eventually declassified. They make for disturbing reading. Between 1941 and 1945, Hitler received thousands of injections. The logs list drug after drug: oxycodone, cocaine, methamphetamine, hormones, vitamins, experimental compounds. Morell notes Hitler's responses: improved mood, increased energy, better sleep, decreased tremors. But here's what's strange about Morell's logs. They're too detailed in some ways, too vague in others. He precisely records injection times and drugs used, but he never notes total dosages, never tracks patterns of tolerance or dependency, never mentions withdrawal symptoms. For a doctor treating the most powerful man in Germany with a complex cocktail of powerful drugs, Morell's records are simultaneously meticulous and inadequate. What did Morell understand about what he was doing? Did he recognize he was creating and maintaining drug dependency in his patient? Or did he rationalize the injections as necessary medical treatment? The logs never reveal his thinking. They're pure data dates, times, substances, brief notes on Hitler's condition without reflection or analysis. Hermann Göring presents a different case. He's been addicted to morphine since being wounded during the beer hall putsch in 1923. By the 1940s, he's taking massive doses, daily doses that would kill most people. His addiction is an open secret within the Nazi leadership, but no one dares confront him about it. Allied interrogators after the war find Göring in terrible condition, severely addicted, his health destroyed by decades of morphine use. During his captivity, American doctors force him through withdrawal and document the process. Their reports describe a man whose decision-making capacity, whose personality, whose very identity had been shaped by morphine dependency for more than 20 years. The question haunts the historical record. How many crucial decisions during the war were made by leaders under the influence of drugs? How much of Nazi Germany's strategic planning happened in rooms where the most powerful men were chemically altered? We know Hitler received injections before major speeches and meetings. We know Göring was perpetually on morphine. We know other Nazi leaders used various substances. But we can't know how these chemicals affected the decisions that shaped history. The counterfactual is unanswerable. Would the war have unfolded differently if Hitler hadn't been receiving daily injections of oxycodone and cocaine? Would strategy have changed if Göring's judgment hadn't been clouded by morphine? The questions multiply endlessly, and every answer is speculation. By 1942, the Wehrmacht's relationship with Pervitin has shifted. The High Command, finally acknowledging the addiction and psychological damage, attempts to restrict distribution. New regulations require medical officer approval for Pervitin use. The drug is reclassified from freely available to controlled substance. But here's the reality behind the regulations. It's far too late. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have become dependent. Units that have been using Pervitin for years cannot suddenly stop. When Pervitin supplies become restricted, combat effectiveness collapses. Soldiers accustomed to fighting on methamphetamine cannot fight without it. The withdrawal symptoms alone are debilitating. A Wehrmacht general's memo from November 1942, found in Soviet archives after the Cold War, describes the impossible situation. Pervitin restrictions have created severe morale problems in multiple units. Soldiers who have been using the drug for extended periods cannot maintain combat effectiveness without it. Attempts to enforce restrictions have resulted in plummeting performance, increased sick calls, and disciplinary problems. Yet continued use produces psychological damage and physical deterioration. We face a choice between short-term combat effectiveness and long-term soldier health. Given current military situation, short-term effectiveness must take priority. Recommend resuming Pervitin distribution despite known risks. The choice was made, the tablets kept flowing, and the Wehrmacht's addiction to methamphetamine deepened even as evidence of its destructive effects accumulated. The home front mirrors the military's pharmaceutical dependence. Factories run around the clock, workers sustained by Pervitin rather than adequate sleep or nutrition. The regime's demands for productivity are impossible to meet through human effort alone. Chemical assistance becomes necessary. A factory foreman's diary from Essen, dated March 1943. Production quotas increase every month. The workers cannot possibly meet them without help. So we distribute Pervitin at the start of each shift. The company physician provides it completely legal, completely official. The workers become machines. They work 12, 14, 16 hours without complaint. But I've noticed changes. They're losing weight. Their hands shake. Some talk to themselves. One worker collapsed last week, heart attack, at age 32. The doctor said it was unrelated to Pervitin. But I wonder. The foreman's diary ends in July 1943. Factory records show he was transferred to another position. Whether the transfer was related to his questioning of Pervitin use, we don't know. But the pattern is familiar. People who ask uncomfortable questions tend to disappear from the historical record. Mothers take Pervitin to manage wartime privation while their husbands fight far away. Teenagers take Pervitin to maintain enthusiasm for Hitler Youth activities. Even children receive Pervitin administered by teachers to help students focus during increasingly long school days. A teacher's testimony, given during a denazification hearing in 1946. We were told the tablets were harmless, that they simply helped children concentrate. The school physician distributed them personally. Some children took them daily for months. I didn't question it. Questioning anything during that time was dangerous. But I noticed the children changed. They became less like children. More focused, yes, but also more mechanical. Less playful, less spontaneous. Like small adults, serious and driven. I told myself it was the war, making them grow up fast. But it wasn't just the war. Was it? It was the tablets. The teacher's testimony was recorded but never investigated further. The denazification process focused on political crimes, not pharmaceutical ones. The systematic drugging of German society, including children, received minimal attention from Allied authorities, overwhelmed by far more obvious atrocities. Germany becomes a nation running on methamphetamine. The Third Reich's achievements, the rapid rearmament, the military conquests, the industrial productivity, all have a chemical foundation that few outside observers suspect. The regime has effectively weaponized addiction, turning it from a social problem into a tool of state power. But biological reality cannot be indefinitely postponed. Bodies require sleep, minds require rest. Hearts and livers and kidneys cannot sustain methamphetamine exposure indefinitely. The bill comes due always, eventually, inevitably. And when it comes due, the cost proves catastrophic. A Temler executive's letter to a colleague, dated January 1944, discovered during corporate litigation in 2007, reveals the company's growing awareness of problems. Pervitin sales remain strong despite military setbacks. However, disturbing reports are accumulating. Physicians describe patients suffering severe side effects. Military medical officers report addiction rates far exceeding initial projections. We have received inquiries from government officials about potential liability. Legal counsel advises maintaining strict confidentiality regarding internal discussions of product risks. Recommend all future correspondence on this matter be verbal only. The letter's significance extends beyond its content. It proves Temler executives knew, by early 1944, that Pervitin was causing serious harm. They knew addiction rates were far exceeding projections, which implies projections existed, that addiction was anticipated if not intended. And they knew to hide this knowledge, to avoid creating documentary evidence of their awareness. How many other such letters were written and then destroyed per the executive's recommendation? How many verbal conversations happened that left no trace? The surviving letter exists only because the executive kept a personal copy in his home files, which his family donated to an archive decades after his death. The luck of preservation reveals what systematic destruction has hidden. By late 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorates, Pervitin production becomes erratic. Allied bombing targets pharmaceutical factories. Raw material supplies become unreliable. The tablets that flowed so freely in earlier years are now precious and scarce. The scarcity creates a new crisis. An entire nation beginning to experience withdrawal simultaneously. Soldiers who've been fighting on methamphetamine for years suddenly lack access. Factory workers accustomed to chemical assistance must meet impossible quotas without it. The productivity that seemed like evidence of Aryan superiority reveals itself as unsustainable pharmaceutical enhancement. A physician's report from Berlin, dated October 1944, describes civilian withdrawal symptoms. Patients present with severe depression, exhaustion, and inability to function. Many report previous Pervitin use, some for months, some for years. The drug is no longer readily available. The withdrawal proves incapacitating. Patients cannot work, cannot care for families, can barely leave their beds. No effective treatment exists. I can only document their suffering and wait for biological systems to slowly recover. Recovery time appears to correlate with duration and intensity of use. Those who used Pervitin heavily for years may require months to regain normal function. Germany cannot afford months of recovery time. The war continues. The bombs still fall. But the people who must respond are collapsing from withdrawal. The report was filed with Berlin's Public Health Department. It generated no response. By October 1944, Berlin's bureaucracy was barely functioning. Reports were filed, recorded, and forgotten. The physician continued documenting cases until April 1945, when Soviet forces entered Berlin. His final reports describe a city in absolute collapse physically from bombing, psychologically from trauma, chemically from mass withdrawal. The question haunts the empty hours when the pills wear off. What happens when the drugs run out? What happens to a society that's been running on methamphetamine for years when the supply suddenly stops? The answer is written in the ruins of German cities, in the hollow eyes of survivors, in the testimony of people who lived through the final collapse. It's written in archive boxes scattered across multiple countries, fragments of a story no one has fully assembled, pieces of evidence no one has completely connected. The Third Reich that promised to purge Germany of Weimar's pharmaceutical decadence instead created something far worse. The regime that condemned cocaine and morphine distributed methamphetamine on an unprecedented scale. The leadership that spoke of strength and purity spent the war years chemically altered, making world-changing decisions while under the influence of powerful drugs. And when it all collapsed, when the supply ran out and the bill came due, the truth about what had sustained the Third Reich became another secret to be buried, another chapter to be erased from official histories, another crime without perpetrators or victims willing to testify. In Temmler's corporate archives, accessible only to authorized researchers, certain files from the 1930s and 40s remain classified. The company cites patient privacy, commercial confidentiality, legal sensitivities. But researchers who've seen the catalogue listings report something curious. Enormous gaps in the numbering system. Files that should exist, that the catalogue structure indicates existed, are simply missing. Were they destroyed? Lost? Deliberately removed? The questions have no official answers. Only suspicions. Only patterns that suggest someone, at some point, decided certain truths were too dangerous to preserve. The white powder that Temmler manufactured and the Wehrmacht distributed changed the course of history in ways we're still discovering. Changed it through the soldiers who fought beyond human limits. Changed it through the workers who produced beyond human capacity. Changed it through the leaders who decided while chemically altered. Changed it through the children who grew up taking tablets for focus. Changed it through the families that collapsed when supply became scarce. Changed it in ways documented and ways lost, in archives opened and archives sealed, in testimonies given and testimonies silenced. The story isn't over. The questions aren't answered. And somewhere in classified files and sealed archives and family attics, the missing pieces wait to be discovered if anyone dares look, if anyone's allowed to see, if the truth hasn't been too thoroughly destroyed to recover. November 1942. The Sixth Army advances into Stalingrad, 300,000 men pushing deep into the ruined city. They fight for every building, every room, every staircase. The battle becomes a meat grinder, and somewhere in the chaos of urban warfare, the supply lines begin to fail. The Luftwaffe airlift attempts to sustain the encircled army. The planes bring ammunition when they can land. They bring food when space permits. Medical supplies when anything remains after prioritizing weapons. But they cannot bring enough Pervitin to satisfy an army that's been running on methamphetamine for 3 years. The withdrawal begins slowly. At first, just exhaustion deep, crushing exhaustion that sleep cannot relieve. Men who fought for days without rest suddenly can barely stand. The cold becomes unbearable. The hunger intensifies. Depression descends like a physical weight. Then the psychological symptoms emerge. Paranoia, hallucinations, irrational fears. Men shoot at shadows. Officers issue commands to subordinates who aren't there. The siege becomes not just a military encirclement but a chemical crisis, an entire army experiencing methamphetamine withdrawal in the midst of the war's most brutal battle. A lieutenant's diary, found on his frozen corpse by Soviet soldiers, describes the descent. Day 43 of encirclement. The pills ran out last week. The men are changing. Weber sees Russians everywhere, even in our own bunker. Schneider hasn't spoken in days, just stares at the wall, won't eat, won't respond to orders. I feel it too. The bone-deep exhaustion, the certainty that we're all going to die here. Before, we had the pills and everything seemed possible. Now we have nothing, and the truth is inescapable. We're already dead. We just haven't stopped moving yet. The next entry, dated 1 day later, is almost illegible. Can't think straight. Too tired, too cold. Where are the pills? Why won't they send the pills? We need the pills more than food, more than ammunition. Can't fight without them. Can't even stand without them. The diary ends there. The lieutenant's body was identified from his papers. He was 24 years old. Soviet records indicate he died from exposure and malnutrition. But the diary suggests something else contributed the collapse of a mind and body that had been sustained by methamphetamine for too long, suddenly cut off from the drug that had become more necessary than food. Medical officers in the Stalingrad pocket send desperate reports back to headquarters, or try to. Most never arrive. The few that survive describe catastrophic conditions. Soldiers incapacitated by withdrawal symptoms, unable to perform duties, massive morale deterioration, request immediate Pervitin resupply, situation critical. The requests go unanswered. The Luftwaffe is already flying beyond sustainable limits just to deliver basic supplies. There's no capacity for pharmaceutical shipments. The army that advanced on methamphetamine will die without it. 300,000 German soldiers entered the Stalingrad encirclement. Fewer than 6,000 returned home. The official history attributes the catastrophe to Soviet resistance, winter conditions, and strategic failures. All true. But buried in the testimonies of survivors, in the fragments of diaries recovered from corpses, in the medical reports that somehow escaped destruction, another factor emerges. The withdrawal. The chemical crisis within the military crisis. The collapse of men who'd been fighting on stimulants for so long that their bodies no longer knew how to function without chemical assistance. A Soviet military physician, interviewed in the 1960s, described examining captured German soldiers from Stalingrad. They were in terrible condition, starving, frozen, traumatized, but there was something else, something I'd never seen before. They shook uncontrollably. They couldn't focus their eyes. Some screamed about hallucinations. Others sat catatonic, unresponsive to any stimulus. At first we thought it was shell shock or exposure psychosis. But the pattern was too consistent, too specific. These men were suffering from something beyond the normal trauma of war. The Soviet physician didn't identify it as stimulant withdrawal. He'd never encountered methamphetamine addiction on this scale. But his description matches the symptoms precisely. The Soviet medical establishment documented these strange cases but never determined their cause. The reports sat in military archives for decades, one mystery among thousands generated by the war. Only recently have researchers connected these Soviet medical reports to German documents about Pervitin distribution. The two archives, read together, reveal what neither could prove alone: that methamphetamine withdrawal played a significant role in the Sixth Army's collapse. But here's what remains unknown. How many German soldiers died not from Soviet bullets or cold or hunger, but from withdrawal symptoms? How many became so incapacitated by the absence of Pervitin that they couldn't defend themselves, couldn't take cover, couldn't maintain the will to survive? The question has no answer. The medical records that might reveal the truth, if they ever existed, vanished in Stalingrad's ruins. Across the entire Eastern Front, the story repeats. As Germany's industrial capacity strains under Allied bombing and resource shortages, Pervitin production becomes erratic. Some units receive regular supplies, others go weeks without tablets. The inconsistency proves almost worse than total absence. Men alternate between methamphetamine-fueled combat and withdrawal-induced collapse. A Wehrmacht doctor's report from Army Group Center, dated March 1943. The Pervitin supply situation has become untenable. Units receive irregular shipments, often in quantities insufficient for their size. Soldiers who have been using the drug for extended periods cannot function without it. I have documented cases of soldiers unable to perform basic duties during withdrawal, cannot maintain watch, cannot march, cannot respond effectively to combat situations, yet when Pervitin is available, the same soldiers demonstrate superhuman endurance. We have inadvertently created a military force that requires continuous pharmaceutical support to maintain combat effectiveness. This is unsustainable. The report concludes with a damning assessment. We are no longer commanding soldiers, we are managing addicts who happen to be armed. The Wehrmacht High Command's response to such reports, when responses exist at all, emphasizes military necessity. The war continues. Combat effectiveness must be maintained. The pills must keep flowing despite all evidence of their destructive effects. A memo from Wehrmacht headquarters, dated June 1943, states bluntly, Pervitin remains essential for sustained operations. All medical objections are noted but overruled by operational requirements. Distribution will continue as supplies permit. The memo's bureaucratic language masks a horrifying reality. The army has acknowledged its addicting soldiers and chosen to continue anyway. The short-term tactical advantages of methamphetamine outweigh in the judgment of senior commanders the long-term destruction of their soldiers' health. But did those commanders understand what they were choosing? The documents suggest uncertainty, confusion, willful ignorance. Some officers seem genuinely unaware of methamphetamine's addictive properties. Others clearly know but feel they have no alternatives. Still others appear to have convinced themselves that German soldiers' superior discipline will allow them to overcome dependency after the war. The delusion proves catastrophic. There is no after the war for hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, and those who survive will carry their addictions home to a nation that cannot acknowledge or treat them. The home front suffers its own chemical crisis. By 1943, Allied bombing raids devastate German cities nightly. In the bomb shelters, families huddle together while their neighborhoods burn overhead. The psychological strain proves unbearable for many. People take whatever drugs they can obtain, Pervitin to stay alert during raids, morphine to numb the terror, sleeping pills to achieve unconsciousness between attacks. The pharmaceutical industry still operates production reduced by bombing but not eliminated, and the available drugs flow to whoever can pay or has connections. A diary from a Hamburg woman, dated July 1943. We spent 6 hours in the shelter last night. The bombs fell so close that dust rained from the ceiling. Children screamed. Adults prayed. I took 2 Pervitin tablets before the raid. My neighbor gave them to me. She takes them every night now. Says she can't face the shelters without them. The tablets helped. I didn't feel the fear as intensely, didn't flinch at every explosion. But this morning, I feel hollow. Exhausted beyond sleep, she offered me more tablets. I took them. God help me, I took them. Tomorrow there will be another raid, and I'll need them again. How long can this continue? The diary continues for 8 more months, the entries growing increasingly desperate. The woman takes Pervitin more frequently, the doses increase, the raids continue. Then, abruptly, the diary ends in March 1944. No final entry, no explanation. Hamburg's records show her apartment building was destroyed in an air raid that month. Whether she died in the raid or survived it, the archive offers no answer. Her diary exists only because she'd given it to a friend for safekeeping, a friend who survived and eventually donated the diary to a museum. How many similar stories vanished with their authors? How many diaries, letters, testimonies burned in the same fires that destroyed their writers? The surviving documents are extraordinary precisely because survival was so unlikely. The pharmaceutical factories themselves become bombing targets. The Allies initially don't target them deliberately. They're attacking general industrial capacity. But the effect on drug production proves significant. When the Temmler works in Berlin takes a direct hit in September 1943, Pervitin production drops precipitously. The supply crisis cascades through German society. Military units receive priority, but even they face shortages. Civilian workers who've been taking Pervitin to maintain productivity suddenly can't obtain it. The result? A nation beginning to experience mass withdrawal while still trying to function under wartime conditions. A factory manager's memo from Essen, dated November 1943. Production has fallen 23% in the last month. Worker absenteeism has tripled. When I investigate, the pattern is consistent. Workers who were previously taking Pervitin to maintain extended shifts now lack access to the drug. They report crushing fatigue, inability to concentrate, severe depression. The company physician confirms these are withdrawal symptoms. He has no solution. The pharmaceutical supply chain has broken down. We cannot meet production quotas with workers in this condition, but we cannot obtain the drugs that previously enabled quota achievement. Request guidance. No response to this memo appears in company files. Perhaps none was ever sent. By late 1943, Germany's bureaucratic systems were beginning to fail under the weight of the war. Problems were reported but rarely solved. The memo was filed, and the factory continued operating at reduced capacity, its workers suffering through withdrawal while bombs fell overhead and the Eastern Front collapsed. The medical system, already overwhelmed by war casualties, faces an addiction epidemic it cannot address. Hospitals lack the resources to treat combat injuries, let alone addiction. Doctors continue prescribing drugs, morphine for pain, Pervitin for exhaustion because they have no alternatives. Some physicians are themselves addicted, their judgment compromised by the substances they prescribe. A physician's testimony from a denazification hearing in 1946 describes the medical situation in Berlin during the war's final years. We had nothing. No antibiotics, no surgical supplies, no staff, no space. Patients died in hallways waiting for beds, and in the midst of this chaos, we had soldiers and civilians addicted to Pervitin or morphine, demanding drugs we couldn't provide even if we wanted to. I turned away dozens daily. Some became violent, some threatened me, some begged with a desperation that still haunts me. But I had nothing to give them. The pharmaceutical supplies were depleted, the warehouses were bombed, the distribution systems had collapsed, so they suffered, and I could only watch. The physician broke down during this testimony. The hearing officer noted that he appeared emotionally distressed and required a recess to compose himself. The testimony continues after the break, but the physician's voice, according to the transcript, remains unsteady throughout. The black market flourishes in this scarcity. Morphine and Pervitin become worth their weight in gold, literally. People trade family heirlooms, jewelry, artwork for drugs. Some trade sexual favors, others steal. The social fabric tears under combined pressure of military defeat, urban destruction, and mass chemical dependency. Police records from this period, what remains of them, document the desperation, break-ins at pharmacies and hospitals, assaults on physicians and pharmacists, thefts of medical supplies from bombed buildings. The reports catalogue crime after crime, all motivated by pharmaceutical need. But here's what the police records don't show: the broader patterns. How many crimes? How much violence? What percentage of the population was involved? The statistics that would answer these questions were never compiled, or if they were destroyed. What remains are individual incident reports, fragments of a much larger story. In Berlin's Führerbunker, as the Soviet army closes in during April 1945, Adolf Hitler continues receiving his daily injections from Dr. Morell. But the injections have changed. Supplies are limited. Morell's pharmaceutical sources have been cut off by the advancing Soviets. The complex cocktail that sustained Hitler for years is no longer available in its original form. Hitler's hands shake uncontrollably. His decision-making becomes even more erratic than before. He issues orders that make no military sense, demanding counterattacks from armies that no longer exist. insisting on defense of positions already overrun. Whether this disconnect from reality stems from withdrawal, from the stress of imminent defeat, from mental deterioration, or from some combination of all three, no one can definitively say. Morell's logs from the final days in the bunker are fragmentary and strange. He notes giving Hitler injections but doesn't specify what drugs. He records Hitler's condition in terse cryptic phrases. Patient agitated. Patient insisted on additional treatment. Supplies critically low. The logs suggest Morell himself is struggling, working in a bunker under siege, his pharmaceutical options dwindling, his patient demanding impossible relief. On April 20th, Morell flees the bunker. He abandons Berlin, abandoning Hitler. No explanation appears in his logs. One day he's treating the Führer, the next he's gone. Hitler's valet later testifies that Morell left in fear of his life, after Hitler accused him of trying to drug him into compliance. The irony is terrible. Hitler, sustained by drugs for years, turns against his supplier at the end. Did he recognize, finally, that the injections had enslaved him, or was this just paranoid delusion, another symptom of withdrawal or advancing madness? The question has no clear answer. Morell survived the war but said little about his time with Hitler. His interrogations by American forces focus on other matters. The pharmaceutical questions go largely unasked. Hitler's final orders the demand that Berlin fight to the last citizen. The order to flood the subway tunnels, knowing thousands of civilians shelter there, reflect a mind utterly disconnected from reality. Whether drugs contributed to this disconnection remains one of history's unanswerable questions. We know he was receiving powerful substances for years. We know those substances were opioids and stimulants with profound psychological effects. We know his supply situation became desperate in the final weeks. We can reasonably infer that withdrawal or altered brain chemistry might have affected his judgment, but we cannot prove causation. We cannot say with certainty, Hitler ordered X because he was withdrawing from Y. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and so the question haunts the historical record, unanswerable but unavoidable. May 1945. Nazi Germany dies. The survivors emerge from basements and bunkers into a landscape of total destruction. Cities are ruins. Infrastructure is shattered. The government has ceased to exist. And millions of Germans are addicted to drugs they can no longer obtain. The occupation forces, American, British, French, Soviet, find warehouses full of pharmaceutical supplies, Pervitin tablets by the millions, morphine vials stacked in cases, cocaine packages marked with pharmaceutical company logos. The victors are initially puzzled by the quantities. Then, gradually, through interrogation and investigation, they begin to understand Nazi Germany was a narco-state. The regime had systematically drugged its population, but this understanding never becomes official policy or shapes occupation strategy. The Allies have larger concerns: war crimes, trials, denazification, rebuilding. The pharmaceutical dimensions of the Third Reich receive minimal attention. Some interrogators ask about Pervitin. Some occupation officials note the widespread addiction. But no systematic investigation occurs, no comprehensive documentation effort. The opportunity to understand what happened slips away as witnesses die and documents disappear. A British occupation officer's report from Hamburg, dated July 1945. The German population exhibits widespread signs of drug dependency. Requests for pharmaceutical supplies are constant and desperate. Local physicians confirm that Pervitin and morphine use was ubiquitous during the war. Many, Germans, perhaps hundreds of thousands in this city alone, are now experiencing withdrawal. The medical system lacks resources to treat them. We lack resources to treat them. They simply suffer, another layer of misery atop the catastrophe of defeat. This situation requires attention at the highest levels, but I have received no guidance and no support. The problem is acknowledged but not addressed. The report generated no high-level response. The British occupation government, overwhelmed by immediate challenges of feeding populations and maintaining order, did not prioritize addiction treatment. The report was filed and forgotten. It surfaced only when a researcher studying occupation policy noticed a reference to it in another document and tracked it down in military archives. Returning soldiers discover that civilian Germany has no resources to address their addictions. The hospitals are rubble or requisitioned by occupation forces. The doctors are overwhelmed. The pharmaceutical supplies are controlled by military government. Men who survived the Eastern Front now face withdrawal in destroyed cities, their suffering invisible amid larger catastrophe. A social worker's report from Munich, dated August 1945, describes home visits to returning veterans. In every household, the same story. The soldier came home physically intact but psychologically destroyed. He cannot sleep without nightmares, cannot function without the pills he took during the war. The pills are no longer available. The family watches helplessly as he deteriorates, shaking, sweating, unable to eat or rest. Some have become violent, others catatonic. The families beg for help, but we have nothing to offer. The addiction treatment facilities, if they ever existed, are gone. The physicians who might help are themselves traumatized or missing. These men survived the war only to be destroyed by what sustained them through it. The report is one of dozens filed by Munich, social workers in the months after surrender. They document a city full of addicted veterans, struggling families, and a complete absence of treatment resources. The reports went to Munich's occupation government and generated minimal response. A few treatment centers were eventually established, but they could accommodate only a fraction of those needing help. The silence descends again, heavier than before. No one wants to discuss how Germany drugged itself through 6 years of war. The shame is too deep, the complicity too widespread, the truth too painful. The pharmaceutical companies say nothing. Temmler, Bayer, Merck, they survived the war physically damaged but institutionally intact. They will rebuild, resume production, reclaim market share. Speaking about their wartime role would threaten these goals. So they remain silent, cooperating minimally with occupation investigations, providing only information specifically requested, volunteering nothing. In occupation archives scattered across multiple countries, fragments of truth accumulate. A testimony here, a report there, documents that touch on pharmaceutical issues without fully exploring them. No one assembles these fragments. No comprehensive investigation occurs. The pieces remain scattered, waiting for researchers decades later to discover connections that should have been obvious at the time. The families reunite with men who survived the war, but cannot escape the drugs that sustained them through it. The suffering continues privatized, hidden, unacknowledged. Each family believes it suffers alone, unaware their story repeats in apartment after apartment, city after city. And above it all, the questions multiply. How many died from withdrawal? How many committed suicide rather than face addiction without supply? How many became permanently disabled by prolonged methamphetamine use? How many children witnessed their parents' destruction and carried that trauma forward? The estimates vary. Wildly, some researchers suggest hundreds of thousands severely affected, others claim millions. The gap reveals how little anyone wanted to count, how thoroughly the silence was maintained, how completely the truth was buried. The war ends. But for Germany's addicts, soldiers, workers, mothers, even children who'd been given pharmaceutical assistance, nothing ends. The nightmare simply transforms. The battlefield moves from the front lines to their nervous systems. The enemy becomes the absence of drugs their bodies now require. The casualties accumulate in silence, uncounted and unmourned. In a Soviet prison camp, a captured Wehrmacht officer reflects in a diary entry from December 1945. "We thought we were building a 1,000-year Reich, but we were building it on a foundation of white powder. And when the powder ran out, everything collapsed, not just the government, not just the military, but the very fabric of how we lived. We became dependent on drugs to work, to fight, to simply function, and now we must learn to be human again without them, if we even remember how." The diary was confiscated by Soviet authorities and filed in intelligence archives. It remained there, unread, for 50 years. A researcher discovered it while studying Soviet interrogation techniques and recognized its significance. But by then, the officer who wrote it was long dead. His insights died with him, or would have, if not for the accident of documentary survival and a researcher's curiosity. That's how the truth emerges, not through systematic investigation, not through official acknowledgement, but through fragments discovered by chance, testimonies preserved by luck, documents that survived when destruction would have been easier. The story of withdrawal and collapse is written in these fragments, in scattered archives across multiple countries, in testimonies given and ignored, in questions asked too late, in silences maintained too long, and beneath it all, the central question remains unanswered. When a nation drugs itself into seeming strength, what happens when the drugs run out? We know what happened to Germany. The ruins speak for themselves. But we don't know, can never fully know, how much of that collapse was military, how much psychological, how much chemical. Where one cause ends and another begins, no clear line exists. The factors merge, inseparable and unmeasurable, leaving only the terrible certainty that they converged into catastrophe. 1949. Germany splits into two nations, each inheriting the addiction crisis in its own way. The division happens officially, with treaties and declarations. But the pharmaceutical legacy divides differently, invisibly, carried in bodies and memories, hidden behind reconstructed facades. In the West, the Federal Republic embraces pharmaceutical capitalism. In the East, the German Democratic Republic imposes state control. Both systems inherit millions of addicted citizens. Neither wants to acknowledge the full scope of the problem. The silence that began in the bunker and the ruins continues in the offices of new governments, in the boardrooms of rebuilding companies, in the consulting rooms of overwhelmed physicians. The war is over, the Third Reich is dead, and everyone, collectively and without explicit coordination, agrees to forget about the drugs. But here's what makes this forgetting strange. It requires active effort. The evidence is everywhere. Doctors encounter addicted patients daily. Families watch their fathers and husbands struggle with dependencies. Employers notice workers who cannot function without pills. The pharmaceutical industry knows exactly what it manufactured and distributed. Yet the public conversation remains silent. No government inquiry, no public health campaign, no systematic treatment program. The addiction crisis that should dominate post-war policy barely appears in official documents. Why? The answer lurks in archives that remain partially restricted, in corporate records that companies won't fully open, in government files that carry classifications even 70 years later. The answer involves uncomfortable truths about complicity, about economic priorities, about the desire to move forward without examining too closely where you've been. West Germany's economic miracle rises on foundations built during the war, including pharmaceutical dependency as a tool of productivity. The factories of the Ruhr Valley, rebuilt with Marshall Plan money, employ workers who learned during the war to medicate their way through exhaustion. Some still do. A factory physician's private notes from Essen, dated 1952, donated to a medical archive by his family after his death. The workers know exactly what they want. They don't request pain medication or sleep aids using medical terminology. They ask for the pills that help you work longer. They describe needing to maintain productivity, to meet quotas, to keep their jobs in a competitive economy. Some explicitly mention taking Pervitin during the war. Others just know that certain pharmaceutical assistance makes impossible schedules possible. I prescribe cautiously, aware I'm perpetuating patterns established under the previous regime. But if I refuse, they'll find other doctors or black market sources. At least this way, the drugs are pharmaceutical grade and dosages are controlled. Or so I tell myself. The physician's moral reasoning documented in these private notes, never meant for publication, reveals the impossible position doctors occupied. They recognized the problem but felt powerless to solve it. Individual physicians couldn't reform a system where productivity expectations exceeded human capacity without chemical assistance. The pharmaceutical industry emerges as a pillar of West German prosperity. Bayer, Merck, Hoechst, and others rebuild quickly. They produce drugs for domestic and international markets. They employ thousands. They generate export revenue. They represent Germany's scientific and industrial prowess. These companies have no incentive to examine their wartime role. The opposite, actually every incentive to avoid the subject entirely. Corporate archives from this period, what researchers can access, show careful curation. Documents about wartime production exist but provide minimal detail. Correspondence about military contracts appears but lacks context. The archives tell enough to comply with legal requirements, but not enough to reveal uncomfortable patterns. A Bayer executive's memo from 1954, discovered during unrelated litigation in 2009, addresses historical documentation strategy regarding inquiries about wartime production to provide factual data as legally required but avoid interpretive context. Acknowledge military contracts existed but emphasize we fulfilled legal obligations under circumstances beyond our control. Do not volunteer information about distribution networks, dosage recommendations, or internal discussions of addiction risks. Legal counsel advises this approach minimizes liability exposure while maintaining transparency sufficient for regulatory compliance. The memo's significance extends beyond its content. It proves the pharmaceutical companies consciously shaped their historical record. They decided what to preserve and what to emphasize. They constructed a narrative that acknowledged their wartime activities while minimizing their responsibility for resulting harm. How many similar memos existed? How many meetings discussed documentation strategy? The surviving memo exists only because it became evidence in litigation decades later. The broader pattern, it suggests systematic curation of corporate memory likely produced many more documents that were never preserved or were destroyed per their own recommendations. In comfortable West German suburbs, the silence around wartime drug use becomes absolute. Families hide their secrets behind perfectly maintained facades. New houses, new cars, new appliances, all symbols of economic recovery. Behind closed doors, different realities persist. The returning soldier who needs morphine every night to sleep never discusses why. He takes his pills in private, maintains his job, presents normality to neighbors. His wife knows but doesn't speak of it. The children sense something unspoken but learn not to ask. The family doctor writes prescriptions without comment. Everyone collaborates in maintaining the silence. A psychologist's case, Notes from Munich, dated 1957, found in papers donated to a university after the psychologist's retirement. Patient, male, age 43, presents with anxiety and depression. Session reveals he served on Eastern Front. Uses morphine daily since 1943. Wife insisted he seek treatment because their teenage son found the hidden vials. Patient expresses shame but insists he cannot function without the medication. Says doctors have prescribed it for 14 years, surely if it was wrong, they would have stopped. I suggested gradual reduction. Patient became agitated, said I didn't understand, that people like me who weren't in the war had no right to judge. He did not return for subsequent appointments. The case notes continue with other patients. Several show similar patterns: wartime pharmaceutical use continuing into the 1950s, families maintaining silence until crisis forces acknowledgement, treatment efforts failing because patients cannot or will not engage. The psychologist notes recurring themes: shame, denial, anger at those who question the drug use, and above all, insistence that no one who didn't experience the war can understand the necessity of pharmaceutical support. These case notes document what official statistics miss: ongoing addiction affecting families across West Germany, hidden by shame and enabled by physicians unwilling to refuse prescriptions to veterans. The scale remains unknown because the counting never happens. Each case is treated as individual pathology rather than evidence of systematic crisis. Support groups emerge in the 1950s, tentative, quiet gatherings in church basements. They never mention the war directly. Participants discuss dependency and medication overuse in abstract terms. The connection to wartime experience remains implicit, never stated aloud. A social worker who facilitated such groups in Hamburg writes in a letter to a colleague, dated 1959. The men who attend never speak of combat. They discuss their current struggles with medication, their families' concerns, their desire to reduce usage. But the war haunts every session. You can feel it in the silences, in the careful avoidance of certain topics. Once, a participant began describing his unit's experiences and stopped mid-sentence. The others looked at him with something like fear. The subject was changed immediately. They've created an unspoken rule. We acknowledge the problem, but never its origin. Perhaps they fear that examining the source too closely would make recovery impossible. How do you heal from something you're forbidden to discuss? The letter was never sent. Found among the social worker's papers after her death, it represents private doubt that couldn't be expressed publicly. The support groups she facilitated continued for years, helping some individuals while maintaining the collective silence about why so many Germans needed such support. The medical establishment participates in this silence. Medical journals publish studies on addiction treatment but rarely examine the war's role in creating the epidemic. When researchers do investigate wartime drug use, they focus on military policy and pharmaceutical supply chains, not on the doctors, who prescribed the companies that profited, or the medical profession's ongoing complicity in maintaining dependencies. The Nuremberg trials prosecute many Nazi crimes, medical experiments, euthanasia programs, the Holocaust, but the systematic drugging of soldiers and civilians never becomes a major focus. Some Nazi doctors face justice for other atrocities, but their role in the addiction crisis goes largely unexamined. Why? The documentation existed. Allied forces had captured pharmaceutical company records, military medical files, personal testimonies. The evidence was available for anyone who wanted to investigate, but no one did. Perhaps because the investigation would have implicated too many people who were now useful to the occupation. German doctors were needed to treat German populations. Pharmaceutical executives were needed to rebuild German industry. Engineers and chemists who'd worked on wartime projects were valuable in Cold War competition. Pursuing pharmaceutical crimes would have complicated denazification, slowed reconstruction, created diplomatic difficulties. Or perhaps, and this is darker because the Allies themselves saw potential military applications. American and British military researchers certainly studied German pharmaceutical records. They documented Pervitin's effects on soldiers. They noted the Wehrmacht's experience with methamphetamine-enhanced performance. Did they decide that prosecuting pharmaceutical crimes would be hypocritical given their own interest in similar research? The question remains unanswered because the relevant archives remain partially classified. Some files from Allied investigations of German pharmaceutical practices are still restricted. The official explanation cites privacy concerns and ongoing intelligence sensitivities, but researchers who've petitioned for access report something curious. The restrictions don't follow normal patterns. Some documents from later periods are open, while earlier materials remain sealed. The classification scheme suggests selective preservation of secrets, not blanket protection of sensitive information. East Germany takes a different approach, though the outcome proves similarly inadequate. The socialist state asserts control over all pharmaceutical production and distribution. The government announces that addiction is a capitalist disease, a symptom of Western decadence. East German citizens, living under socialism, are supposedly free from such problems. The official statistics reflect this narrative. Reported addiction rates in the German Democratic Republic are dramatically lower than in West Germany. The government presents this as evidence of socialism's superiority. The workers' state cures problems that capitalism creates. But the statistics are fabrications. A physician who defected to the West in 1962 describes the East German medical system. We were instructed to minimize addiction diagnoses. Patients presenting with obvious pharmaceutical dependency were recorded as having other conditions, depression, anxiety, chronic pain syndrome, anything except addiction. The state pharmaceutical industry produced stimulants and painkillers, distributing them through official channels while denying that dependency problems existed. We prescribed cautiously because we knew the truth, but we couldn't document it honestly. The official record had to show that East German citizens were healthier, happier, less afflicted by the problems that plagued capitalist societies. The defecting physician brought no documentation too dangerous. His testimony stands alone, unverifiable, except through circumstantial support from other sources. But other defectors from East German medical establishment tell similar stories. The pattern their testimonies reveal suggests systematic data manipulation, with true addiction rates hidden behind diagnostic creativity and statistical misdirection. East German factories also run on workers who take pills to meet production quotas. The state pharmaceutical industry produces stimulants and painkillers, distributing them through official channels. Factory physicians prescribe them, workers take them, productivity increases. The system functions much like it did during the war, just with different ideological justification. A factory manager's diary from Karl Marx Stadt, smuggled to the West in 1973. The party demands increased production. The workers are already exhausted. The physicians prescribe stimulants to close the gap between demand and human capacity. No one calls this a problem. The pills are presented as medical support for dedicated workers building socialism. But I see the same patterns my father described from the war years: workers who cannot function without pills, whose health deteriorates, who sacrifice their bodies for production quotas. The ideology changes, but the pharmaceutical solution remains. The diary's authenticity was questioned when it first appeared. East German authorities claimed it was Western propaganda, but subsequent defector testimonies confirmed its accuracy. The diary now resides in a Cold War museum, one of many documents that revealed East Germany's reality didn't match its propaganda. Veterans of the Wehrmacht, now living under communist rule, suffer their addictions in silence, doubly enforced. The shame of addiction combines with political pressure to conform to the ideal socialist citizen. Admitting pharmaceutical dependency could affect employment, housing, children's educational opportunities, so they hide it, self-medicate as best they can, and hope that what they cannot speak of might somehow diminish through silence. A Stasi report from 1965, declassified after reunification, describes surveillance of a suspected dissident. Subject exhibits behavior consistent with pharmaceutical dependency, observed making frequent visits to multiple physicians, presumably seeking prescriptions. Associates with others, showing similar patterns. Possible formation of unofficial support network. Subject's military service records show Eastern Front deployment 1941 through 1945. Assessment. Dependency likely originates in wartime pharmaceutical use. Not political threat per se, but unofficial organization of any kind requires monitoring. Recommend continued surveillance and physician notification to limit prescription access. The Stasi report treats addiction as security concern rather than health issue. The surveillance continued for years. The suspected dissident was actually a veteran trying to manage his morphine dependency through legitimate medical channels while helping other veterans do the same. The unofficial support network the Stasi feared was men meeting to discuss their shared struggle, a threat only in a system where unauthorized gathering of any kind seemed dangerous. How many veterans received similar surveillance? How many East Germans lived under Stasi observation because their wartime pharmaceutical use made them behave in ways the state found suspicious? The Stasi files contain thousands of surveillance reports. Only a fraction mention pharmaceutical dependency, but those that do reveal a pattern. The state tracked addicts not to help them, but to control them. The divided city of Berlin becomes a laboratory for comparing approaches. In West Berlin, pharmacies stock abundant medications and doctors prescribe liberally. In East Berlin, state control restricts access but cannot eliminate demand. The wall, built in 1961, separates not just political systems but pharmaceutical regimes. Yet addiction respects no boundary. A Western journalist visiting both sides of Berlin in 1963 writes, "The division is supposed to represent fundamentally different societies. But in the pharmacies of both systems, I see the same scene: people requesting medications with an urgency that suggests necessity beyond normal medical need. The West's abundance and the East's scarcity create different problems, but the underlying issue remains the same. Both German states inherited populations with pharmaceutical dependencies, and both have chosen to manage rather than solve the crisis. The article was rejected by major publications as too abstract and lacking clear news value. It appeared in a small medical journal, where it generated no significant response. The journalist's observation that both German states were managing inherited addiction rather than addressing it anticipated by decades the historical consensus that would eventually emerge. By the 1960s and 70s, both German states have achieved remarkable economic recovery, but the addiction crisis persists beneath the surface. The generation that fought the war ages with their secret dependencies intact. They pass trauma to their children, though often without explanation. The baby boomers growing up in both Germanys sense something unspoken. Some discover hidden pill bottles. Others notice their father's strange habits or their mother's moods tied to medication schedules. But the culture of silence prevents honest conversation. A woman born in 1953 writes in a memoir published in 2005, "I was 20 years old before I understood why my father kept his bedroom door locked, why certain drawers in his desk were always secured, why he became agitated if anyone touched his medicine cabinet. I found his morphine vials by accident while searching for aspirin. When I confronted him, he said only, 'You don't understand. You weren't there.' 'Where?' I asked. 'The war,' he said. 'I was there. You weren't.' That was the extent of our conversation. He never explained more. I never asked again. Years later, after his death, I learned from his old medical records that he'd been using morphine continuously since 1943, 35 years. My entire life, he'd been addicted, and no one ever spoke of it. How many children grew up with similar experiences? How many families maintained similar silences? The question has no statistical answer because the behavior, by definition, remained hidden. But the memoirs that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s as that generation aged and began reflecting on their upbringing reveal consistent patterns across both East and West Germany. Academic researchers begin studying the war's effects, but addiction rarely features prominently. Historians write extensively about military strategy, political decisions, the Holocaust, but the pharmaceutical dimensions of the Third Reich receive minimal attention. The enormous literature on Nazi Germany contains surprisingly little about systematic drug use. When researchers do investigate wartime pharmaceutical practices, they often face obstacles. Former soldiers unwilling to discuss drug use, pharmaceutical companies unwilling to open archives, government files that remain classified, families that prefer not to revisit painful memories. The research requires persistence through multiple layers of resistance. A historian who spent the 1980s investigating Wehrmacht drug use describes the challenges. Every interview was difficult. Veterans would discuss combat, strategy, even atrocities. But when I asked about Pervitin, they became defensive or evasive. "We took what we were given," they'd say. "We followed orders." They framed drug use as something done to them, not something they participated in voluntarily. Perhaps that's how they needed to remember it. But it made constructing an accurate historical account nearly impossible. The historian's book, published in 1991, was attacked from multiple directions. Veterans groups claimed he exaggerated drug use. Pharmaceutical companies suggested his research was methodologically flawed. Some historians accused him of sensationalism. The book sold modestly and went out of print within 5 years. Only later, as more archives opened and more researchers investigated, did his work gain recognition. The second edition, published in 2008 with new material from declassified files, received very different reviews. What seemed sensational in 1991 appeared well documented by 2008. The intervening years had shifted what could be said about Germany's pharmaceutical past. The question persists. How many Germans remain addicted to drugs first encountered during the war? How many children and grandchildren inherit these patterns? The estimates vary wildly because the systematic counting never happened. Some researchers suggest tens of thousands still affected in the 1970s. Others claim hundreds of thousands. The gap reveals continuing unwillingness to measure what everyone knows exists. What happens to a nation that cannot acknowledge this dimension of its past? The silence deepens as years pass, as witnesses die without testifying, as pharmaceutical companies continue profiting, as both German states prioritize present prosperity over painful historical accounting. But silence doesn't mean absence. In therapy offices across both Germanies, psychologists encounter patients whose problems trace to unspoken family trauma. In support groups, people struggle with dependencies whose origins lie in events they're forbidden to discuss. In hospitals, elderly patients die with pharmaceutical dependencies that began in the 1940s and never ended. The truth circulates in whispers, in family secrets, in documents that survive by accident. It appears in memoirs published decades late, in archives opened reluctantly, in testimonies given at the end of lives when the pressure to maintain silence has finally lifted. A physician in his 80s, interviewed in 2012 for an oral history project, describes his career. "I treated addiction for 50 years. The patients changed in the 50s, it was mostly veterans, in the 60s workers and housewives, in the 70s a younger generation with different drugs. But underneath, the pattern remained constant. We never solved the crisis that the war created. We just managed it, generation after generation, while pretending it didn't exist on the scale it actually did. I'm old now. I can say what I couldn't say during my career. Germany's pharmaceutical industry, Germany's medical establishment, Germany's government, they all chose profit and prosperity over acknowledging and addressing a crisis that destroyed millions of lives. And they're still making that choice." The interview was conducted for a university archive. It remains there, one testimony among thousands, waiting for researchers who might someday assemble the full story from these scattered fragments. Both German states prioritize moving forward. The past is acknowledged in specific, controlled ways: war memorials, Holocaust, education, military history. But the pharmaceutical dimensions remain marginalized, mentioned briefly if at all, never examined with the thoroughness applied to other aspects of Nazi crimes. Perhaps because the pharmaceutical story is too complicated. It lacks clear villains, or rather, it has too many villains, spreading responsibility across the entire society. The chemists who synthesized the drugs, the companies that manufactured them, the doctors who prescribed them, the military leaders who distributed them, the workers who took them voluntarily, the governments that enabled the system. Where does responsibility lie when everyone participated? The question is uncomfortable. Easier to focus on crimes with clear perpetrators and innocent victims. Easier to maintain silence around crimes of complicity, where nearly everyone shares some blame, and so the silence continues. Through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, through reunification in 1990, into the 21st century. The story remains scattered across multiple archives, multiple countries, multiple languages. The pieces exist, but no one assembles them comprehensively. No one writes the definitive history of Germany's addiction crisis, because the research requires access to archives that remain restricted, cooperation from companies that remain defensive, and confrontation with truths that remain uncomfortable. The survivors age and die, carrying their secrets to graves. The children who witnessed their parents' struggles grow old themselves, many without ever understanding what they witnessed. The grandchildren know nothing except vague family stories about difficult times and relatives who suffered nerves. The pattern of silence extends through generations, each inheriting pieces of truth without enough context to assemble the whole. The addiction crisis that should be central to understanding 20th century Germany remains peripheral, acknowledged but not examined, mentioned but not explored. And in pharmaceutical company boardrooms, in government offices, in medical schools, the lessons that should have been learned remain unlearned. The patterns that created catastrophe remain unanalyzed. The mechanisms that enabled mass addiction remain misunderstood, because understanding would require speaking, and speaking would require confronting truths that are easier left silent. Present day. Germany has become a nation of remarkable historical consciousness. School curricula address the Holocaust with admirable thoroughness. Memorials dot the landscape. Museums document Nazi crimes. Political leaders acknowledge historical responsibility. The confrontation with the past seems comprehensive, unflinching. Yet walk into those museums, examine those curricula, read those official histories, and notice what's missing. The pharmaceutical dimensions of the Third Reich receive a paragraph, maybe two. Pervitin gets mentioned briefly. Hitler's injections merit a footnote. The systematic drugging of an entire society warrants less attention than individual battles, specific concentration camps, particular war crimes. Why? The question has no simple answer, but the patterns of silence suggest deliberate choices, not accidental omissions. Consider what full acknowledgement would require. The pharmaceutical companies that still operate as pillars of German industry would need to confront their role not just in manufacturing drugs, but in knowingly creating and sustaining addiction for profit. The medical profession would need to acknowledge systematic failure: doctors who prescribed carelessly, who ignored evidence of harm, who prioritized productivity over health across multiple generations. The military establishment would need to admit it deliberately addicted soldiers, that Wehrmacht leadership knew they were creating dependencies, and continued anyway because tactical advantages outweighed human cost. The government would need to acknowledge that both East and West Germany chose to hide rather than address the addiction crisis they inherited. And perhaps most uncomfortably, ordinary Germans would need to confront the fact that millions of their parents and grandparents participated willingly in pharmaceutical enhancement, that the Third Reich's achievements, the economic recovery, the military conquests, the industrial productivity rested partly on a foundation of mass drug use. That German society embraced chemical solutions to human problems not once, but repeatedly across the 20th century. Full acknowledgement would complicate the narrative Germany has constructed about its past. It would blur the lines between perpetrators and victims, between the guilty and the innocent. It would suggest that ordinary people's choices to take the pills offered, to prescribe them to others, to ignore evidence of harm contributed to catastrophe as much as the decisions of obvious criminals. Easier to maintain. The current partial silence. Acknowledge the pharmaceutical dimension exists while never examining it thoroughly. Mention Pervitin in passing while avoiding systematic analysis. Note that Hitler received injections while never asking how those injections might have affected world-changing decisions. But here's what the silence cannot contain: the questions that emerge when you start pulling threads, when you begin connecting documents scattered across multiple archives, when you notice the patterns of what's missing as clearly as what remains. How many German soldiers became addicted to morphine during World War I? The estimates range from tens of thousands to 500,000, a tenfold difference that reflects deliberate uncertainty. The documentation that would answer this question definitively was either never created or was destroyed. Hospital records show suspicious gaps. Military medical files contain unexplained absences. The statistical surveys that should exist simply don't. Or they did exist once and were destroyed. The pattern of destruction is too consistent to be accidental. Archives that preserve minute details of other medical conditions somehow lack comprehensive addiction data. Files referenced in other documents have vanished. Entire record-keeping systems show evidence of selective preservation. Everything except addiction statistics survived. Why destroy addiction data specifically? What truth were the destroyed records protecting? The questions multiply because the answers were literally burned, shredded, or conveniently lost during various upheavals. How many civilians used cocaine during the Weimar years? Again, estimates vary by orders of magnitude. Was it hundreds of thousands or millions? The pharmaceutical production numbers suggest massive quantities entered the domestic market. The surviving testimony suggests widespread use across all social classes. But the systematic documentation, the kind of public health surveys and epidemiological studies that would provide definitive numbers, was never conducted. Or perhaps it was conducted and the results were deemed too disturbing to preserve. A reference appears in a 1926 memo from Hamburg's Public Health Office to Comprehensive Addiction Survey Results. The memo discusses whether the findings should be released publicly. The decision, according to the memo, would be made at a higher level. No subsequent document mentions the survey. The results, if they existed, have vanished. What did that survey reveal? Numbers so large they seemed implausible? Patterns of use that implicated too many respectable citizens? Evidence of pharmaceutical company complicity that might have affected lucrative business relationships? The questions echo through the archival silence, unanswerable precisely because someone decided the answers were too dangerous to preserve. How many Wehrmacht soldiers took Pervitin during World War II? The military distributed millions of tablets, that much is documented. But distribution records and consumption data are fragmentary. Some units kept detailed logs of pharmaceutical disbursement. Most of those logs have disappeared. What remains are summary reports, aggregate numbers that obscure individual patterns. The Wehrmacht's own medical assessment from 1943 estimated that hundreds of thousands of soldiers had developed problematic dependencies. But here's what's strange. That assessment appears in one document, referenced in several others, but the full report has never been found. Multiple researchers have searched multiple archives. The document that should exist, detailed medical analysis of Wehrmacht drug use and addiction rates, is missing. Was it destroyed during the war's chaos? Deliberately removed during post-war documentation efforts? Hidden in an archive that remains closed? The possibilities are all plausible, which means the truth could be any of them or something else entirely. The uncertainty itself becomes significant. The pattern of missing crucial documents suggests someone, somewhere, decided certain truths were better left unpreserved. Did addiction affect combat performance and strategic decisions? The logical answer is yes. Massive methamphetamine use must have affected judgment, decision-making, risk assessment, but proving causation requires evidence that doesn't exist in systematic form. We have scattered accounts of paranoid behavior, reckless decisions, erratic commands. We have medical reports of stimulant psychosis. We have testimony from soldiers who said the drugs changed how they fought. But we don't have comprehensive analysis linking specific military failures to pharmaceutical factors. Was the disastrous decision to hold Stalingrad influenced by leaders whose judgment was compromised by drugs? Were certain atrocities committed by soldiers in states of stimulant-induced psychosis? Did the Wehrmacht's increasingly irrational strategies in the war's final years reflect leadership suffering from drug-addled thinking? These questions are asked quietly in academic papers, speculated about in footnotes, but never investigated thoroughly. Perhaps because the investigation would require admitting that some of history's most consequential decisions might have been made by people whose brains were fundamentally altered by powerful substances. That the Holocaust, the invasions, the strategic catastrophes, all might have pharmaceutical dimensions that complicate our understanding of responsibility and culpability. The moral questions prove even more haunting. What responsibility did ordinary Germans bear for their own addictions when doctors prescribed freely, when employers expected pharmaceutical enhancement, when military orders included drug distribution, when society normalized chemical use? The question resists simple answers. The veteran who took Pervitin because his commanding officer ordered it, is he responsible for his addiction? What about the factory worker who took stimulants because he'd lose his job otherwise? Or the mother who took morphine because she couldn't cope with wartime stress and her doctor said it would help? Responsibility exists on a spectrum. But acknowledging that spectrum means abandoning simple narratives of victims and perpetrators. It means recognizing that most people occupied a grey area, neither innocent nor guilty, neither forced nor freely choosing, but caught in systems that made pharmaceutical use seem necessary for survival. This complexity explains part of the silence. Simpler stories are easier to tell, easier to memorialize, easier to teach. The pharmaceutical story doesn't fit existing frameworks. It requires nuance, context, an acknowledgement of widespread complicity without absolving obvious criminals. How should history judge the chemists who synthesized these substances with good intentions? Friedrich Serturner believed he was alleviating suffering when he isolated morphine. Felix Hoffmann thought he was creating a safer alternative when he synthesized heroin. Fritz Hauschild probably believed Pervitin would genuinely help workers and soldiers, but good intentions don't negate consequences. Millions became addicted, families were destroyed, societies were reshaped. The chemists' discoveries enabled atrocities and sustained catastrophes. Does their intent matter when the outcome proved so destructive? The question becomes more complex when you realize the chemists themselves often recognized the problems they created. Sir Turner's late letters suggest awareness and regret. Reports from Bayer physicians warned about heroin's addictive properties early on. Temler executives knew Pervitin caused serious harm by 1944. Knowledge without action might be worse than ignorance. If the chemists and companies knew and continued anyway, and the evidence increasingly suggests they did, then their responsibility becomes clearer. But it also becomes shared. The doctors who prescribed knowing the risks. The military leaders who distributed knowing the consequences. The government officials who enabled the system. The patients who took the drugs despite warnings. Where does individual responsibility end and systemic responsibility begin? The question has no clear boundary. And perhaps that's exactly why it remains mostly unasked, because answering it honestly would implicate nearly everyone involved in the pharmaceutical industries, medical systems, and governmental structures of 20th century Germany. Could it happen again? The question isn't hypothetical. Germany, like much of the developed world, faces modern pharmaceutical crises. Opioid prescriptions remain high. Performance-enhancing drugs circulate through universities and workplaces. Stimulant use for productivity continues. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are ubiquitous. The drugs have different names. The delivery systems have evolved. But the fundamental patterns persist. Pharmaceutical solutions to human problems, medical assurances of safety, normalization of chemical enhancement, resistance to acknowledging addiction until crisis becomes undeniable. The historical parallel is uncomfortable. Modern pharmaceutical companies insist they've learned from past mistakes. Modern medical practice emphasizes careful prescription protocols. Modern governments regulate drug production and distribution more strictly. All true, but the mechanisms that created previous crises, aggressive marketing, economic incentives for productivity enhancement, societal pressure to achieve beyond natural capacity, cultural reluctance to acknowledge addiction all still exist. A German physician writing in a medical ethics journal in 2018 makes this point explicitly. We prescribe stimulants to children for focus. We prescribe opioids for chronic pain. We prescribe benzodiazepines for anxiety. We assure patients these drugs are safe when properly used. We monitor for addiction, but often miss early signs. We prioritize immediate symptom relief over long-term health consequences. The parallels to our pharmaceutical history are striking. We've learned some lessons. Dosages are more carefully calibrated. Addiction risks are more openly discussed. But have we learned enough, or are we repeating patterns we haven't fully acknowledged? The article generated controversy. Pharmaceutical companies suggested the comparison was inflammatory and historically inaccurate. Some physicians argued modern practices are fundamentally different from past mistakes. Others defended current prescription patterns as evidence-based and necessary. But here's what's notable. The article forced a conversation that rarely happens. It connected past to present explicitly. It asked whether Germany's historical pharmaceutical experiences should inform current medical practice. The conversation faded quickly. One article, some responses, then silence. But the questions it raised remain unanswered. The contemporary resonance of these historical questions has become undeniable. Young Germans use stimulants to study longer, work harder, achieve more. The substances are different. Ritalin instead of Pervitin, Adderall instead of methamphetamine, but the motivation is familiar. Chemical enhancement to meet expectations that exceed natural human capacity, and the patterns of silence persist. Students don't discuss their stimulant use with parents. Workers hide their pharmaceutical productivity aids from employers. Doctors prescribe while expressing private reservations they don't document. Everyone maintains plausible deniability while participating in systems that normalize drug use. A university student interviewed for a documentary in 2020 describes this dynamic. Everyone in my program uses something. Maybe not every day, but during exams, during thesis, writing, during the crunch times. We don't talk about it openly, but we all know. The professors probably know too, but they don't ask. As long as we meet the deadlines and produce the work, no one questions how we manage it. Sometimes I wonder if my grandparents' generation felt the same way, everyone doing it, everyone knowing, everyone silent. The student's speculation proves more historically accurate than she probably realizes. The patterns she describes, widespread use, tacit knowledge, maintained silence, mirror exactly what happened during the Pervitin era. The scale is different, the substances are different, but the dynamic is hauntingly familiar. What can modern Germany learn from this hidden history? The answers might prove uncomfortable. The story reveals how easily medical science becomes corrupted by economic incentives. How quickly societies normalize drug use when it serves productive purposes. How thoroughly shame and silence prevent honest reckoning with pharmaceutical harm. How patterns repeat when history remains unexamined. The historical lesson suggests that nations face recurring temptations to embrace chemical solutions to human problems, to prioritize short-term performance enhancement over long-term health consequences, to distribute drugs widely while ignoring addiction risks, to maintain silence about growing crises until they become impossible to deny. But learning these lessons requires first acknowledging the full history, and that acknowledgement remains incomplete. The pharmaceutical dimensions of the Third Reich are mentioned but not examined. The addiction crises of World War I and Weimar are footnoted but not studied. The post-war inheritance is referenced but not investigated. The patterns that connect past to present are visible but not analyzed. Why does this silence persist? The answers accumulate like layers of sediment, each generation adding its own reasons for not speaking. The pharmaceutical companies still operate, still profit, still hold market power. Full historical accounting might invite lawsuits, damage reputations, complicate business relationships. Better to acknowledge past mistakes in abstract terms while resisting detailed investigation. The medical profession still prescribes, still treats, still holds authority. Acknowledging the extent of historical failures might undermine contemporary legitimacy. Better to treat past medical errors as unfortunate but understandable given the knowledge of the time. The government still regulates, still oversees, still sets policy. Admitting that both East and West Germany chose silence over truth might complicate current public health strategies. Better to present current approaches as enlightened departures from the past rather than continuations of problematic patterns. And ordinary Germans still remember, still carry family secrets, still maintain inherited silences. Speaking openly about grandparents' addictions might complicate family narratives, challenge cherished memories, force confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Better to let sleeping secrets lie, to honor the dead by maintaining the silences they kept in life. The reasons compound. The silence deepens, and the full story remains scattered across multiple archives, multiple countries, multiple languages, pieces that researchers occasionally connect, but no one has assembled comprehensively. But here's what makes the silence ultimately unstable. The truth keeps surfacing. Archives open. Documents emerge. Witnesses testify before dying. Researchers notice patterns. Each year brings new revelations, new connections, new evidence that the pharmaceutical crisis was even larger than previously documented. A researcher discovers a cache of letters in a relative's attic, a Wehrmacht medical officer describing Pervitin distribution in detail. Another finds pharmaceutical company records during unrelated litigation, executives discussing addiction risks in 1944. A third obtains access to previously restricted Allied intelligence files, reports on German drug use that were classified for 70 years. The discoveries are incremental, No single document proves everything, but collectively, they paint an increasingly clear picture. The pharmaceutical crisis wasn't a minor detail of German history. It was central to military capability, economic productivity, social organization, and ultimately to catastrophic collapse. The truth emerges despite institutional resistance, despite cultural silence, despite all the mechanisms designed to maintain comfortable ignorance. It emerges because evidence survives in unexpected places, because some people feel compelled to document what they witnessed even when documentation seems dangerous, because archives, no matter how carefully curated, contain fragments that reveal larger patterns, because the scale of what happened was too large to hide completely. In 2019, a German television network produced a documentary about Wehrmacht drug use. It featured interviews with historians, testimony from elderly veterans, pharmaceutical company responses to questions about wartime production. The documentary was careful, balanced, well-researched. It presented evidence without sensationalism, asked questions without prejudging answers. The response was revealing. Veterans groups attacked it as defamatory. Some historians praised it as overdue. Pharmaceutical companies provided statements emphasizing how different modern practices are from past mistakes. Young Germans watched it with fascination and horror. Many had never heard this dimension of their history. The documentary didn't reveal any single shocking fact. Researchers had documented everything it presented, but it assembled the fragments, connected the patterns, made the story accessible to general audiences. It transformed scattered academic knowledge into public awareness. For about 3 weeks, Germany discussed its pharmaceutical past more openly than ever before. Then the conversation faded. Other news dominated. The moment passed. But something had shifted. The story, once told, cannot be completely forgotten. The questions, once asked, continue echoing. And in archives around the world, researchers continue working, connecting documents across languages and borders, finding patterns in what's missing as well as what remains, interviewing the last living witnesses before their memories disappear forever, assembling the comprehensive history that should have been written decades ago. The story emerges slowly, incompletely, with gaps that may never be filled. But it emerges. What will we discover in archives that remain sealed? What documents survive in private collections, waiting for families to donate them? What testimony could elderly Germans provide if someone asked the right questions? The potential for new revelations remains. But the window closes. The witnesses die. The documents decay. The opportunities for comprehensive understanding diminish with each passing year. Eventually, the full story may become impossible to recover, not because it was never documented, but because the documentation was destroyed or sealed or simply lost before anyone assembled it comprehensively. That possibility that crucial truths might vanish beyond recovery makes the current silence particularly tragic. Germany has the opportunity now to confront this history fully, to examine the pharmaceutical dimensions of its 20th century experience, to learn lessons that might inform contemporary practice. But that opportunity won't last forever. The questions accumulate as sleep approaches. In how many German homes do descendants still find hidden pills from the war years, forgotten medications tucked in attics or old suitcases? How many family medical histories contain gaps and silences around the war period? How many veterans took their addiction? Stories to graves unshared? How many doctors maintained silence out of professional shame or legal liability? How many pharmaceutical company executives chose profit over truth? The questions multiply because the documentation is incomplete, the witnesses are dying, and the investigation began too late. But the questions persist. They haunt the empty spaces in archives. They echo through family silences. They surface in contemporary debates about pharmaceutical use. They connect past to present in ways that suggest unlearned lessons and recurring patterns. What did Germany's pharmaceutical genius reveal about the double-edged nature of scientific progress? How does a nation reconcile pride in medical achievement with acknowledgement of the suffering those achievements caused? Can historical understanding grow even when crucial evidence has been lost or destroyed? What stories remain buried in family memories, waiting for a generation brave enough to speak them aloud? The questions fade into dreams, unanswered but unforgotten. They remain alive in the minds of researchers who notice patterns in archives, in the memories of families who carry secrets, in the concerns of physicians who see contemporary parallels, in the consciousness of a nation that has learned to confront difficult truths but hasn't fully confronted this one. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Some historical truths resist easy resolution. Some silences persist because the truth they hide implicates not just clear villains but entire societies. Some chapters of history remain unwritten because writing them would require confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature, scientific hubris, and collective responsibility. The white powders that German chemistry gave the world promised everything: relief from pain, escape from exhaustion, enhancement of human capability. They delivered on those promises. For a time, until the bill came due, until the addiction became undeniable, until the catastrophe became impossible to ignore. And when the catastrophe passed, when the ruins were cleared and the rebuilding began, Germany faced a choice. Acknowledge the full truth about what sustained the Third Reich, or maintain selective silence about the pharmaceutical dimensions while confronting other crimes openly. The choice was made, though never explicitly stated. The silence was maintained, though never officially declared. The truth was scattered, though never completely destroyed. It remains scattered still, waiting in archives that might open, surviving in documents that might be found, living in memories that might be shared, available to researchers willing to search, discoverable by nations willing to look. The story isn't over. The questions aren't answered. But they remain available to anyone who dares ask them, anyone who's willing to search through archives, anyone who's brave enough to speak what others have kept silent, anyone who recognizes that understanding the past completely, even the uncomfortable parts, especially the uncomfortable parts, might be the only way to avoid repeating it. As sleep finally comes, one last question lingers. When the full history is finally written, if it's finally written, what will it reveal that we still don't know? What secrets wait in sealed archives? What truths survive in family attics? What patterns will emerge when all the fragments are finally assembled? The answer lies waiting. In archives across multiple countries, in memories not yet shared, in documents not yet discovered, in connections not yet made. The story of Germany's addiction to hard drugs isn't finished being told. It's only beginning to be understood. And the most important revelations, the ones that might change how we understand the 20th century, that might reshape how we think about pharmaceutical use, that might prevent future catastrophes, those revelations may still be waiting to be discovered. Waiting in shadows, where the truth always waits, patient and persistent, ready to emerge when someone finally asks the right questions, looks in the right places, and has the courage to speak what they find.